Hello everyone, I'm here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. Sarah Mitchell had never been one to believe in superstition. Mirrors were just mirrors. After all, nothing more than glass and silver, reflections of the world around her. But as she stood in the foyer of her new apartment, unpacking box after box of books and clothes, she couldn't shake the strange feeling that the old mirror in the corner of the room was watching her. It was large, perhaps too large for a simple entryway, and framed with intricate carvings, the kind of design you'd expect to find in a centuries-old estate. The wood was dark, worn in places, and in the right light, it almost seemed as though it had a life of its own. Her first thought had been that it was out of place, an old relic left behind by the previous tenant, something that would need to be moved to the curb. But it had been one of those small things that seemed to weigh heavily on her mind as she unpacked the rest of the apartment. There was a history in this place, Sarah could feel it. And that mirror? It was at the heart of it all. The first night in the apartment, as she sat on the couch sipping tea, she couldn't stop glancing at it. It wasn't just the size that bothered her, or the dark frame. It was how it seemed to loom, always present, always reflecting the room with a slightly unsettling clarity. And yet, she never remembered seeing it in the same way. Was the angle off? Had the light shifted? She couldn't say for certain. It started with the little things. She'd be walking through the living room, caught in thought, and glance at the mirror. For a split second, her reflection would be off, just enough to make her pause. Perhaps she'd moved too quickly, or the lighting in the room had caused some weird distortion. But the second time it happened, she couldn't ignore the sensation of something different. The reflection wasn't her own. It felt distant, like it was looking at her, studying her movements. Sarah shook the feeling off, dismissing it as tiredness. The apartment had been a chaotic mess of unpacking and cleaning, and she hadn't slept well in days. She went to bed early that night, hoping to fall into a dreamless sleep. When she woke the next morning, the reflection was the last thing on her mind. The sun streamed through the window, painting the room in soft, golden hues. Sarah stretched, enjoying the calm of the new day. But the mirror caught her eye again as she crossed the room to make her coffee. This time, it wasn't the angle or the light. Her reflection was slightly delayed. Sarah froze, her fingers still wrapped around the door handle. She blinked, then turned to face the mirror. In the glass, her reflection was several seconds behind her, as though it had been caught in time, like it was struggling to catch up. She frowned and took a step forward. Her reflection mirrored her movements perfectly, but there was a strange feeling, almost like it was mocking her, repeating her gestures in an exaggerated way, lingering just a moment longer than she did. It was unsettling. Her heart thudded, but she shrugged it off. "You're imagining things, Sarah," she muttered to herself. It was an old apartment, after all. Maybe the mirror had a crack in it, or something else was distorting the image. But the feeling lingered. Later that evening, Sarah found herself sitting on the couch, reading through an article for work. Her mind wandered as she read the same sentence over and over. Something was pulling at her attention, but she couldn't place it. She glanced up at the mirror. There was nothing remarkable about it, just the usual. The furniture, the half-empty bookshelf, the angle of the lamp in the corner. But this time, she felt a deep, crawling sensation run down her spine. The reflection was wrong. The room in the mirror was off. The chair by the window, the one she hadn't moved, was positioned at an angle she didn't remember. And the coffee cup on the table beside the couch, it wasn't where it was supposed to be. In fact, it was slightly closer to her reflection, too close. Sarah's breath caught. She stood up, her pulse racing, and moved toward the mirror, her hand trembling as it reached for the frame. The air around her felt heavier, like the room was thick with the weight of her thoughts. As she stepped closer, her reflection mirrored her exactly, but just a second too late. It was as if she could see her movements in the glass, but also something else, something watching her. Her reflection's eyes were locked on hers. They were dark, unfamiliar. The subtle difference in her expression was undeniable. The reflection's mouth was turned downward in a frown that didn't quite match Sarah's own. There was a flicker of something behind those eyes, something too cold to be human. Sarah stumbled back, her breath shallow. The room felt too still, the silence too thick. Just the lighting. She whispered to herself, her voice trembling. She had to get some sleep. She was overworked. She was just tired. But she couldn't shake the feeling that the mirror was more than just a reflection. That night, she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, willing herself to ignore the echo of the mirror's gaze in her mind. But even as she closed her eyes, she couldn't escape it. The feeling was still there. The mirror wasn't just a mirror anymore. It was something else, something that watched her. Sarah couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, her mind would replay the eerie, delayed reflection from earlier in the day. The memory of her own face staring back at her, almost as if it were waiting for something, kept her awake. The quiet hum of the city outside only added to the pressure in the room, the silence pressing in from every corner. She tossed and turned in the bed, but sleep wouldn't come. She finally gave up and reached for her phone, hoping the distraction would calm her nerves. As she unlocked the screen, a notification flashed. An email from the landlord. Just a reminder, the previous tenant left the mirror as a parting gift. Some people say it's got character. Hope you enjoy your new place. Character. The words felt like a mockery. Sarah set the phone down, the thought of that mirror twisting in her mind like a dark thread. She couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just some leftover piece of furniture. There was something wrong with it. Something off. The apartment felt colder now, even though the temperature hadn't dropped. She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, but the chill in the air wasn't just physical. It was a sense that something unseen was just beyond the edge of her perception, always waiting, always watching. Without thinking, she found herself pulling on her slippers and padding out into the living room. Her heart raced in her chest, but she couldn't ignore the pull. The mirror had to be checked. It had to be confronted. As she stepped into the room, the reflection of the apartment greeted her as usual. But it wasn't quite the same. The reflection seemed to stretch, distorting the shapes in the room, as if trying to take on a life of its own. Sarah's eyes immediately went to the chair by the window, the one that had been in a different position earlier. It was right again, in the place she had left it, but she couldn't shake the feeling that it had been moved on its own. Her own face appeared in the mirror, her eyes wide and nervous, a mirror image of the fear growing inside her. But then something flickered. The reflection didn't move in time with her. It paused, just for a moment, and then her reflection smiled. It wasn't the same smile that she wore. This one was too wide, too knowing, stretching across her face with an almost sinister quality. Her hands trembled at her sides, but her reflection reached out as though trying to touch the glass. Sarah's pulse quickened as she took a small step back, her breath quick and shallow. In the mirror, her reflection's fingers were inches away from the surface of the glass, but Sarah felt a deep, visceral sense that it wasn't just the glass that separated them. There was something else now, something alive in the way the reflection watched her, the way it held her gaze without blinking, waiting for her to make a move. "Stop it," Sarah muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. She turned on her heel, desperate to escape the suffocating grip of the mirror. But as she crossed the room, her reflection remained, standing still, watching her. Its expression didn't change. It simply mirrored her actions. But now, she felt the weight of its gaze following her every step. She reached the hallway and paused. The reflection hadn't moved. It was still in the living room, staring at her with that unnerving, mocking smile. "Stop," she repeated, her voice a little firmer this time. But even as she spoke, she could feel her own reflection not just looking at her, but judging her. It was watching her every move, studying her. She took another step, then another. But as she reached the hallway, she heard a strange sound, a faint, soft tapping coming from the living room. At first, she thought it was her imagination. Maybe the walls were settling, or maybe it was just the wind. But then it came again. Tap, tap, tap. Her breath hitched in her throat as she turned back toward the living room. The mirror was no longer reflecting the room behind her. it was showing the reflection of the hallway. Her own image was standing there, just inside the doorway of the living room, watching her with that same unsettling smile. But now, the reflection had taken a step forward. It was closer to her than it had been a moment ago. Her heart raced, and panic began to claw at the edges of her mind. She had to get away. With a jolt, she turned and fled down the hallway, her footsteps echoing off the wooden floor. She could feel the cold creeping along her spine as she ran to her bedroom, closing the door behind her with a desperate slam. She leaned against it, breathless, her pulse thundering in her ears. She grabbed the nearest chair, wedging it under the door handle, as if that would stop whatever was in the other room. But deep down, she knew it wasn't the mirror she needed to escape from. It was her reflection. The hours passed in a blur of restless pacing and anxious glances toward the door. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the reflection wasn't just some trick of the light or a simple distortion. Something more was happening, something alive, and the thought made her blood run cold. By the time the first rays of dawn crept through the window, she had reached a quiet, desperate conclusion. The reflection was changing. It wasn't just mimicking her anymore. It was becoming something else, something darker, and it was only a matter of time before it took over completely. Sarah didn't sleep that night. Every time her eyes drifted shut, her mind would snap back to the mirror, the reflection that was no longer just a reflection. It was a presence, an entity that she could feel in the deepest parts of her chest. It was in her mind now, coiling around her thoughts, pulling at her sanity. She could almost hear its whisper, as if the glass itself was calling to her. The next morning, the apartment felt different. The sunlight pouring through the window was dim, as though it too was hesitant to touch the room. It didn't feel like her space anymore. It felt like a cage. Sarah stood in the doorway of her bedroom, staring down the hallway toward the living room. The mirror was waiting for her. She couldn't see it directly from where she stood, but she could feel its presence. The coldness of its gaze was an ever-present weight on her shoulders. It wasn't just that it reflected the room anymore. It reflected her, all of her doubts, her fears, her insecurities. And now, it seemed to want something in return. She took a deep breath, her fingers curling into fists at her sides. She had to face it. She couldn't keep running. But as she stepped into the hallway, the quietness of the apartment was suffocating. She could hear her heartbeat echoing in her ears. Every step felt too loud, too deliberate, as if the mirror was waiting for her to make a mistake, to falter. And then she saw it, the reflection in the living room. But it wasn't just a reflection. It was like the mirror itself had come to life. The room and the glass was warped, like a dream, distorted by some unseen force. The furniture was slightly askew, the light dimmer than it should have been, and her reflection was standing in front of the glass, watching her move. This time, it didn't mimic her actions. It moved independently of her. Sarah froze. The figure in the mirror raised its hand, slowly, almost deliberately, and then, without warning, it slammed its palm flat against the surface of the glass. The sound was sharp, echoing through the room, like a slap of thunder in the stillness. The reflection's mouth stretched into that same mocking grin. It wasn't just her face anymore. The expression was alien, too wide, too wrong. It was almost hungry. She took a step back, but the reflection didn't stop. The hand pressed harder against the glass, as if trying to break through. For a moment, Sarah thought she saw something else in the reflection, a shadow, moving in the corners of the mirror, too quick to be real. Her breath caught in her throat. She couldn't take her eyes off it, even though everything inside her screamed to look away. Then the reflection spoke. Its voice was cold, harsh, almost like a hiss. "Come closer." It was her voice, but it wasn't her voice. There was something wrong in the way the words escaped its lips. The tone was different. It was the sound of a predator, the calm before an attack. "Stop," Sarah whispered, her legs shaking beneath her. She had to get away. She had to leave this apartment. But the mirror, it was pulling her in, and with each passing second, it felt stronger. Her reflection wasn't just a passive reflection anymore. It was an entity, a separate force trying to claim her. She backed away, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't stay here. She couldn't let the reflection take over. But before she could turn to leave, the reflection in the glass did something that made her blood run cold. It raised its hand, and she felt the pressure. A sharp, agonizing pain shot through her wrist. She screamed in surprise and horror, clutching her arm. The sensation was like an invisible force pulling at her, as if something in the mirror was attached to her body. She stumbled back toward the hallway, the pain intensifying with every movement. The reflection mirrored her movements, but this time there was no delay. The figure's smile stretched wider, its eyes darkening with malice as it watched her writhe. "Come closer." The voice was a command now, not a plea, a demand. And Sarah realized, with a sickening twist of fear, that the reflection was no longer interested in watching her. It wanted to replace her. She could feel the air around her crackling with tension as she scrambled toward the door, her pulse racing, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She didn't care anymore. She had to escape, had to get away from that thing, the thing that wasn't her. She could feel it growing stronger, could feel the pull of it inside her, trying to drag her closer, trying to force her back toward the mirror. She yanked open the door to the hallway and bolted for the stairs. As she descended, she heard the faint tapping sound again, just behind her. Tap, tap, tap. It was the reflection, following her, keeping pace with her every move. She could feel its eyes on her, even though she dared not look back. She reached the front door and tore it open, stepping into the cool night air. The chill felt like freedom, but even then, the weight of the mirror pressed on her chest. And then, as she turned to flee down the street, she caught a glimpse of the reflection in the apartment window. It was standing there, watching her from behind the glass, its face twisted in that same malicious grin. Sarah's heart stopped. She could feel it. Deep in her bones, the reflection was still there. It wasn't just a reflection anymore. It was alive, and it was waiting. Sarah didn't stop running. Her breath was ragged, and her legs burned, but she couldn't slow down. The apartment building was already far behind her, lost in the shadows of the street. She didn't dare look back, but she could still feel it. The presence. It was with her, following her, even in the night air. Every step felt heavier, like her body was being dragged toward that place. She couldn't escape it. She had left the building, she had left the mirror, but it was still there. In her mind, in the edges of her vision, she could still feel the weight of those eyes, the reflection watching her, waiting for her to falter. Her mind raced, searching for an answer, searching for someone to help. But who could help her? Who would believe her? She didn't even fully understand it herself. The mirror wasn't just a piece of glass. It was something ancient, something hungry, and it was growing stronger the longer she stayed away from it. The city felt suffocating now. Every street corner a reminder that she was never truly alone. She found herself at a small park, its trees casting long shadows beneath the streetlights. She staggered to a bench and collapsed onto it, clutching her head in her hands, trying to calm the frantic thoughts swirling through her mind. But the moment she stopped moving, the pressure built again. It was as if the mirror wasn't confined to the apartment anymore. It was in the air. The shadows seemed to stretch toward her, the trees casting distorted shapes that almost resembled the edges of the mirror's frame. Sarah couldn't think. She couldn't breathe. She tried to focus, to hold on to something concrete, something real. Her heart was hammering in her chest, her fingers trembling. The reflection was still there, waiting for her to return. It wanted to take over. It wanted to be her. She jumped up from the bench, the urge to move becoming overwhelming. She had to do something. Anything. She had to end this, to find a way to escape the mirror's grasp. But she had no idea how. She wandered the streets for hours, her feet aching, her mind spinning. It was only when she found herself standing at the edge of the river that something shifted. The mirror's presence was there, but it felt different, more distant. Not gone, but muted. For the first time in hours, she felt a sliver of hope. Maybe she could leave the city. Maybe she could put miles between herself and that cursed apartment. Maybe that would be enough to stop the mirror, to stop the reflection. Her breath came in slow, steadying gasps as she stared down at the dark water. She could almost hear the reflection's voice again, echoing in her mind, telling her to come back. But it didn't feel as sharp anymore. It didn't feel like it was pulling her. It felt desperate, weak. As she stood there, gathering her resolve, she glanced up at the reflection of the street lamps in the water. The lights shimmered on the surface, casting soft ripples. But then, one of the reflections in the water seemed to shift, just like the mirror, just like it had been before. It was her reflection, but it wasn't. The reflection in the water smiled. It wasn't a mockery of her, but it wasn't her smile either. It was wide, unnaturally so, and as she looked at it, her reflection's grin grew even wider, stretching until it almost looked like a grotesque caricature. The reflection in the water raised its hand and pressed it against the surface, just like the one in the mirror. Sarah stepped back, her chest tightening. Her own hand, despite her best efforts, raised in response. "Don't move." The thought wasn't hers. It was as though the reflection was trying to command her. She tried to scream, but the words caught in her throat. Her reflection's fingers started to stretch outward, as if reaching through the water, through the glass, through everything. She could feel the weight of it, the oppressive pressure bearing down on her chest. The reflection in the water wasn't just mimicking her anymore. It was reaching for her, just as the one in the mirror had done. And then it spoke. "Come back." It was the same voice, the same commanding voice, but it was not a voice she could ignore. With her heart pounding, Sarah turned and ran. She didn't know where she was going anymore, didn't know if it would make a difference. But the further she ran, the louder the voice in her mind grew. The reflection's presence seemed to follow her, dragging her forward, inch by inch. The streets blurred together. Her feet stumbled over the uneven pavement as she fought to keep her mind together. But the reflection was everywhere now, inside her head, in the corners of her vision, in the very air she breathed. She could hear it again, that voice. The mirror, the reflection, it was all one, connected. A force that had been waiting for her, and now it would never let her go. She reached the apartment building once more, not realizing how she had come back, or why she had returned. But there she was, standing in front of the door, her chest tight with dread. She had run and run, but it was always there, just behind her, pushing her back. The reflection wasn't just in the mirror anymore. It was in her mind. She could feel it watching her as she opened the door. The hallway stretched before her, quiet, too quiet, like the calm before the storm. But when she stepped inside, she realized something was wrong. The air was thick. The shadows didn't shift with the light. The hallway felt endless, stretching far beyond the space it should occupy. And at the end of the hall, in the place where the mirror had been, was only darkness. But from that darkness came a voice. Her voice. It's time. The reflection was here, and it wasn't going to let her leave. The darkness at the end of the hall grew heavier, as if it were pressing in on Sarah's very soul. Every step she took toward it felt like wading through thick, viscous air. Her feet dragged, as though something invisible was pulling her back, pulling her toward the thing waiting in the shadows. The feeling of dread intensified with each passing second, suffocating her. She wanted to turn and run. Every instinct screamed at her to escape, to get out of the apartment before whatever was waiting in that darkness consumed her. But her legs wouldn't obey. It was as if the reflection, that thing, had taken control of her body too, just as it had taken control of the mirror. She could feel the tug in her chest, pulling her forward like a puppet on invisible strings. It's time. The voice was louder now, sharper. It wasn't just her voice anymore. It was the reflection's voice, the one that had tormented her from the glass, from the water, from the very air. It was close now, far too close. She didn't want to look into the darkness, but it was too late. The pull was too strong. With trembling hands, she reached for the light switch. Her fingers grazed it, but as she flicked it up, nothing happened. The light didn't flicker. It didn't shine. The hallway remained swallowed by shadows, and the only illumination came from the faint reflection of her own eyes in the darkness. She heard a low, guttural sound, a sort of scrape like nails on glass, and it froze her in place. A shiver ran down her spine. She didn't want to turn around, but she couldn't help herself. Slowly, she glanced over her shoulder. The mirror was no longer in its usual spot, but something else had taken its place. The glass had shattered, cracks spider-webbed through its surface, but the reflection still remained. Only now, it wasn't just her face staring back. No, her reflection had become a twisted mockery. The figure in the mirror smiled at her with that same grotesque grin, the one that stretched too wide, too far. It wasn't her smile anymore. It was too wrong, too monstrous. The reflection moved, reaching its hand forward from the broken glass, as if trying to break free, to step out into her world. "Come closer," it whispered again. The words slid in her mind like a cold, invasive thing, burrowing deep in her thoughts, pulling at the very core of her being. And then something shifted. The reflection stepped forward into the hallway. "No," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. But it wasn't her voice anymore. The words were not hers. The reflection's mouth opened wider, and it spoke, its voice now a dark, deep echo of her own. "You've always been mine. Now, you will be whole again." The thing, the reflection, stepped further out of the broken mirror, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette being pulled by unseen strings. Sarah couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. It was taking her life piece by piece. She could feel the pull, feel herself unraveling. It was taking over, claiming her, making her a part of it. But deep down, in the pit of her stomach, something stirred. A flicker of defiance. She wasn't just going to let this thing swallow her whole. She wasn't going to let it win. She would fight. With all the strength she could muster, Sarah tore her eyes away from the reflection, pushing herself back toward the door. Her feet dragged against the floor as though the very shadows were trying to suck her in, but she kept moving. She had to get out. She had to escape before it was too late. Her breath was ragged, her legs screaming in protest, but she made it to the door. She grabbed the handle, and for the briefest moment, the world outside felt like freedom. She twisted the knob, and then the reflection was behind her. It was no longer a mere mirror image. It was a thing now, a presence that surrounded her, pressing against her skin, tightening like a vice around her chest. "You can't run from me," the reflection purred. "You're already mine." Her hand was shaking as she turned the knob. The door wouldn't budge. It was locked. She slammed her shoulder into it, desperate, frantic, but it didn't move. The reflection was behind her now, breathing down her neck. She could feel its cold breath, colder than the air around her, suffocating her. The voice, now a twisted symphony of mockery and hunger, echoed through her skull. "The longer you resist, the more I take. You cannot escape yourself." Her reflection's eyes glowed now, a faint red, as it stepped closer, its grin impossibly wide. It wasn't just in her mind anymore. It wasn't confined to the mirror. It was real, alive. Sarah screamed. She could feel her body weakening, her limbs growing heavier, like the reflection was feeding on her, draining her. But then, in that final moment, as the reflection reached toward her, Sarah did the one thing she hadn't tried before. She closed her eyes. In the dark silence of her mind, she clung to one thought, one single defiant pulse. "I am not you." The reflection hesitated. Its grotesque smile faltered for just a moment. For a fleeting second, the bond between them was broken. The thing from mirror recoiled, as if confused. Unseen, Sarah gathered every ounce of willpower she had left and swung the door open. She ran. She ran into the night, leaving the apartment behind her, leaving the reflection and the mirror and everything that had been holding her in its grip. She didn't look back, but even as she sprinted down the street, she could still feel it. The weight, the pressure, the reflection's gaze, cold and unyielding, following her every step. She didn't know how much longer she had before it found her again, but she knew one thing. The mirror hadn't finished with her. Not yet. Sarah didn't stop running, her breath coming in sharp gasps as her feet pounded against the pavement. The night air bit at her skin, but it did nothing to dull the cold dread spreading through her chest. She couldn't shake the feeling that the reflection was still there, lurking in the edges of her mind. just beyond her reach. Her thoughts were disjointed. Her pulse was thunderous in her ears, drowning out everything else. She didn't know where she was going. She didn't know if running would make a difference. But she had to keep moving. She had to get as far away from that apartment, from the mirror, from the thing that had been wearing her skin and her voice. She found herself on an unfamiliar street, her legs aching, the adrenaline of her flight beginning to wear off. She slowed down, forcing herself to take deep breaths, trying to steady her racing heart. The city around her was eerily quiet, the usual sounds of traffic and life replaced by an oppressive stillness. She glanced over her shoulder. The streets were empty. There was no sign of anyone, but the reflection was still there. She could feel it watching her, the presence in her mind, cold and insidious, waiting for her to slip, to falter. She stumbled onto a bench in a small park, her knees giving out beneath her. The world around her seemed to blur, spinning in circles. She put her hands on her face, trying to calm the pounding in her skull. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the reflection, its grin, its eyes, its outstretched hand. It was always there, even when she wasn't looking. What did it want? Why was it after her? The question gnawed at her, but every time she tried to think clearly, it was like her mind was being pulled away from her, sucked into that mirror, into that thing. Suddenly, the air shifted. The temperature dropped, and a chill ran through her, deeper than the cool breeze of the night. Her breath fogged in the air, though the sky above was clear. Her skin prickled with a sense of wrongness, like something was about to break the fragile silence. And then she heard it, a soft scraping sound coming from the shadows. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was faint at first, but it grew louder. It was a sound she recognized. The same sound the reflection had made when it pressed its hand against the glass. Sarah's blood turned to ice. She didn't need to look to know what it was. She could feel it. The reflection was here. She turned her head, just slightly, to glance at the street behind her, her heart racing. She saw nothing. The street was empty, the lights casting long shadows across the pavement. But the feeling of being watched was unbearable. The air was thick with it, pressing against her chest. Tap, tap, tap. Closer now. The sound was coming from behind her. Slowly, Sarah turned around. The park was still empty, but the trees, those dark, twisted silhouettes against the sky, seemed to shift. They moved as if they were alive, their branches swaying unnaturally, too stiff for the breeze. Her breath hitched. She felt it. The thing from a mirror was here, in this world, manifesting itself around her. The reflection stepped into the corner of her vision. It was impossible. It shouldn't have been real. But there it was. Just like before, it was her, but not. The twisted smile, the too wide grin, the empty eyes. The figure was emerging from the shadows like it had been waiting for her to look. "You can't run from me forever," it whispered. Its voice was cold and hollow, yet it echoed inside her head. Every word vibrated through her skull, filling her with a sick, bone-deep terror. "You are me. You always have been." Sarah backed away, her hands trembling. The thing. It was more than a reflection now. It was here, in her world, and it was starting to take shape. Its body was becoming more defined, like smoke gathering in human form, growing in size and stature with each breath she took. "No!" Sarah gasped. Her chest constricted. The reflection took another step forward. The smile stretched impossibly wide. The grin so grotesque it felt like it would tear the figure apart. "You belong to me." The voice was louder now, booming in her mind. She pressed her hands to her ears, desperate to block it out. But it was useless. The reflection was in her head, and it was drowning her in its demands, in its hunger. She had to get away. There had to be a way out. But the reflection was closer now, standing just a few feet away, its distorted face inches from hers. Sarah could feel its cold breath against her skin. It wasn't just watching her anymore, it was touching her. She stepped backward again, but the reflection followed, mimicking her every movement. But it wasn't just mimicking her, it was twisting her, bending her own movements against her will. Sarah's body responded to its commands without her consent, her arms lifting, her hands reaching forward, as if she were offering herself to the thing. "No!" Sarah screamed, her voice breaking. But the reflection only grinned wider, its eyes glinting with malice. "You are mine." It was too much. Sarah couldn't fight anymore. She felt herself breaking, her mind splintering under the pressure, unable to hold onto any sense of self. The reflection was pulling at her, tearing her apart from the inside out. And then, as if in some final, twisted embrace, the reflection stepped forward and its cold hand touched her face. For a moment, everything was still, and then Sarah's vision blurred. She gasped, her chest heaving with panic, but there was no air. The world around her had gone dark, empty. It wasn't the park anymore. It wasn't the city. It was a cold, unfeeling void. Her body felt strange, like it wasn't hers. And then she saw it, her reflection. But it wasn't just a reflection anymore. It was her, or at least it looked like her. But she could feel it now. It was the one in control. She wasn't the one looking anymore. She was the one trapped, staring out from inside the mirror, watching as it took over. It spoke then, its voice thick with satisfaction. "You see? I told you. You can never escape yourself." And as the last of Sarah's consciousness faded away, she realized with horror that she had lost the fight. The reflection had won, and it had taken everything. Sarah's consciousness drifted in the cold, empty space of the void. It was a suffocating nothingness, as if she were floating in some kind of limbo, with no direction, no sense of time, and no sense of self. There was only the feeling of being, of existing, but nothing to anchor her, nothing to hold on to. Then, slowly, a faint light began to glow in the distance, the smallest spark in the endless darkness. At first, it was just a flicker, like a candle flame struggling to stay alive. But as Sarah focused on it, the light grew brighter, stronger, drawing her attention. She couldn't resist it. Her thoughts were a jumbled mess, but one impulse broke through: go to the light. She didn't know why, but she moved toward it, slowly at first, as if unsure if her limbs would obey. But the further she moved, the more solid her body felt. The emptiness, the oppressive cold, started to fade, replaced by the warmth of the light. As Sarah stepped closer, the light transformed. It wasn't just a light anymore. It became a door, an opening. Beyond it, she could see a glimpse of her apartment, the familiar hallway that led to the living room. Her apartment, the one place she had been trying to escape from, the one place she had fought so hard to leave. But now there was something different. The air felt thick with dread. The reflection's voice echoed in her mind again, its mockery clear. "You thought you could escape me? You thought you could leave? You will never escape yourself." The door swung open, and Sarah stepped through. The moment her foot crossed the threshold, she found herself back in the apartment. The air was stale and heavy, but the reflection was nowhere to be seen. For a moment, everything was still. She felt disoriented, her body unsteady as she looked around. The same dark corners, the same peeling wallpaper. Everything was the same, yet it wasn't. Something was wrong. The mirror, the thing that had haunted her since that first night. The presence that had taken root inside her made her feel like she wasn't herself anymore. She could feel it now, as though it were watching her, just beyond her peripheral vision. And then she heard it, that scraping sound again, the faintest tap, tap, tap. Her heart lurched in her chest. "No," she whispered. The reflection couldn't be here. It couldn't be. She had escaped it. She had fought through it. She spun around, eyes searching for the source of the sound. The hallway was empty. The mirror was still there, cracked like a jagged wound in the wall, but there was no movement. Her breath came in short gasps, but then she saw it. In the corner of the room, barely noticeable at first, was a figure, a shape, standing still, watching her. A twisted silhouette. Her heart pounded. The reflection. It was standing there, waiting, but this time, something was different. This time, she wasn't sure if it was her reflection or if it had truly taken over. She couldn't tell if she was looking at herself or the thing that had been pretending to be her. "I told you," the figure whispered, its voice like ice against her skin. "You cannot run from me. You are me. We are one." The figure moved, but it wasn't just mimicking her this time. It was more alive, more real. It was walking toward her, each step making the shadows dance, stretching unnaturally long. The smile, that impossible grin, was there, wide and grotesque, but it was also real. It wasn't just an illusion anymore. You cannot escape. You belong to me. Terror clawed at Sarah's chest. She took a step back, her mind racing. The reflection wasn't just an image in the mirror anymore. It was a force, a presence that had crossed into her world, becoming part of her, part of everything. And it was coming for her, inch by inch, filling her with a cold, suffocating fear. She had tried to escape. She had run, but there was no escaping this. The reflection was inside her mind. It was inside her, wearing her like a second skin. You will never be free. Not from me. It hissed, taking another step closer. And then, just when it seemed like the reflection would swallow her whole, something shifted. A sudden pull in the very air around her, like the atmosphere had changed. A rush of warmth, a flicker of hope. The apartment started to distort, its walls bending and warping. The reflection froze mid-step, its grin faltering. A new voice. Leave her alone. It wasn't Sarah's voice. It wasn't the reflection's. The voice was stronger, commanding. And with it, the air around Sarah seemed to break free of the reflection's grasp. The figure in front of her recoiled, its smile twisted in confusion, fear even. And then it faded. Like smoke, like mist, it unraveled before her eyes, its edges turning into nothing, swallowed by the surrounding shadows. For a moment, everything was still. Sarah's chest heaved as she tried to make sense of what had just happened. Her heart raced, but the pressure, the weight of the reflection, lifted. She could breathe. The oppressive darkness was gone. The air was no longer thick with fear. But she was not alone. A figure stood before her, hazy at first, then more defined. It was a woman, tall, her features soft but solemn, with eyes that shone with an otherworldly light. She was like an echo from another realm, but Sarah recognized something familiar in her. The woman smiled gently, though her expression held deep sadness. "I'm not who you think I am," she said softly, "but I am here to help you. The reflection, it cannot be allowed to take you. Not now, not ever." Sarah opened her mouth, but no words came. She didn't understand. How was this woman here? Who was she? The woman's expression softened, as if understanding her confusion. She reached out, her hand warm but insistent. "You were never truly alone in this fight." Before Sarah could respond, everything around her shuddered. The walls of the apartment began to warp again, the mirror flickering with the reflection's ghostly image. The voice, the one that had haunted her, was starting to return. "You can't escape." The woman took Sarah's hand firmly. "You can, but you must choose now." The apartment trembled around them, the reflection's power rising once more. Would Sarah fight back? Would she trust the stranger? Or would she be claimed by the reflection forever? The apartment felt like it was shifting, stretching, twisting under the weight of the reflection's presence. The walls groaned, and the lights flickered, casting eerie, fleeting shadows that seemed to writhe and twist with life of their own. Sarah could feel the temperature drop, the familiar chill that signaled the return of the reflection's grip. She knew it was coming. She could hear it, feel it. Its voice echoed in the back of her mind, cold and dark, like a shadow that refused to fade. "You can't escape," the voice whispered again, growing louder, more insistent. But Sarah held onto the woman's hand tightly, the warmth of it a grounding force in the chaos that surrounded them. She didn't understand who this woman was, or how she had appeared in the apartment. But in that moment, Sarah knew she had no choice but to trust her. The woman's eyes glowed softly, her gaze filled with a knowing, as though she had seen all of this before. "You're not the first," the woman said, her voice steady, but tinged with sadness. "And you won't be the last. The reflection has claimed many before you, but it doesn't have to claim you." "Who are you?" Sarah gasped, her voice trembling. How? How do you know all this?" The woman gave a small, sorrowful smile, as if she had expected the question. "I was once like you," she said softly. "I once stood in your place, trapped in the reflection, lost to it. But I fought back, just as you can. Sarah's mind raced. Was it possible? Could she really fight this thing? Could she overcome the reflection that had been tormenting her? The voice in the apartment, the reflection, spoke again, louder now, shaking the very foundation of the room. You can't run from me, Sarah. You're mine. You always have been. No, Sarah cried out, but her voice felt weak, swallowed up by the growing presence of the reflection. The room seemed to pulse with its power, and the mirror at the far end of the room began to ripple, its glass surface distorting, twisting into something grotesque. I told you. The reflection taunted, its voice distorted, as though it was coming from every direction at once. You can't escape. You are me, and I am you. The woman squeezed Sarah's hand tighter. Don't listen to it. You have the power to resist. It feeds on fear and doubt. You have to fight, or it will consume you completely. Fear surged through Sarah's chest, choking her. How could she fight it? How could she face something so powerful, so overwhelming? It had already taken so much from her. Her peace, her sense of self. And now, it was trying to take her very soul. The reflection in the mirror warped again, its form shifting, becoming more monstrous, more alive. Sarah could see her own face, twisted into an unnatural grin, the eyes dark and soulless, staring at her from within the glass. The reflection reached out, as if trying to pull itself out of the mirror, its hand pressing against the surface with an audible crack. You are me, it hissed. You always have been. You belong to me. The woman stood tall, her presence unwavering, and Sarah realized something in that moment. This woman, this figure, wasn't afraid. She had faced this exact thing before, and she had survived. And somehow, she had come out stronger. If she could do it, maybe Sarah could too. With a shaky breath, Sarah took a step forward, feeling the woman's hands steadying her. The reflection in the mirror hissed, its form writhing violently, like an animal trapped in a cage. The woman's eyes glowed brighter now, and she whispered to Sarah, her voice firm, yet gentle. Focus on yourself, Sarah. You are not the reflection. You're more than that. You have your own strength. For the first time, Sarah looked at the reflection, not with fear, but with defiance. The thing in the mirror was not her. It was a twisted mockery of her, an echo of something dark, something that wanted to consume her. But it wasn't her. Sarah's heart beat faster, but this time, she felt the power of her own will. The reflection was right about one thing. It had fed on her fear, on her confusion, but it had never known her true strength. It had never understood that she wasn't the person it saw in the mirror. She wasn't that thing. With a cry of determination, Sarah stepped toward the mirror. The reflection screeched, its form warping, the distorted grin turning into a snarl of rage. It reached toward her, its hand clawing at the air, but Sarah didn't flinch. She focused on herself, on the strength deep inside her. She was not going to be its puppet anymore. No, she shouted, her voice clear and powerful. For the briefest of moments, the reflection faltered, its grip loosening. It was afraid. It was weaker than it had let on. The woman beside her nodded. Now, Sarah, destroy it. Without thinking, Sarah reached out, her hand touching the surface of the mirror. She felt a surge of energy flow through her, warm, bright, full of life and power. The reflection screamed, its face contorting in agony as the light around Sarah intensified, burning away the darkness. For a moment, everything went white, and then there was nothing. When Sarah opened her eyes again, she was standing alone in the apartment. The mirror was gone. The air was still. The suffocating presence of the reflection had disappeared. There was no more scraping, no more taunting voice in her mind. She was free. The woman was gone too, but Sarah could still feel her presence, like a lingering warmth. It was as though she had passed on the strength, the wisdom to fight. She glanced around the room, the familiar walls no longer oppressive, no longer twisted. She could breathe again, her heart steady. The reflection, whatever it had been, was no longer a threat. But Sarah knew this. She had faced it, and she had won. The reflection would never control her again. She had learned that she was more than it. She was her own person, her own soul, and she was free. And for the first time in what felt like forever, she smiled. Sarah stood there, taking in the stillness of the room, her chest rising and falling with deep breaths. It was hard to fully grasp what had just happened, what had almost happened. She had come so close to losing herself, to being swallowed whole by the reflection, but now she was free. Her fingers brushed across the spot where the mirror had been, but there was no longer a crack in the wall, no evidence of the thing that had haunted her for so long. She glanced around the apartment, almost expecting the reflection to reappear, to twist reality once more. But there was nothing. The silence felt almost deafening, but in a strange way, it was comforting. The air was lighter, the space no longer oppressive. Her apartment was hers again. She wasn't a prisoner anymore. Yet, deep down, something tugged at her, a lingering question that refused to let go. She couldn't shake the feeling that the reflection was still out there, somewhere, waiting. The woman who had helped her, who had fought beside her, had spoken of others before her. What had she meant by that? What happened to them? Her mind started to wander, but then something shifted in the corner of the room. At first, it was a shadow, a slight movement that caught her attention. She turned sharply, her heart leaping in her chest, but when she looked, there was nothing. Just the empty apartment. She exhaled, her body tensing. The fear, deep, primal, unshakable, was still there. It hadn't fully left her, not yet. How could it? After everything she had gone through, how could she truly believe she was free? The doorbell rang, startling her. Sarah froze, her body going rigid as the sound echoed through the quiet apartment. Who could that be? She wasn't expecting anyone. Not now. Not after all of this. The seconds stretched on like an eternity before she reluctantly made her way to the door. She hesitated, her hand resting on the doorknob, heart hammering in her chest. What if it was the reflection? Somehow, what if it had found a new way in? She breathed deeply, trying to steady herself, and opened the door. Standing on the other side was a woman. Her face was familiar, but Sarah couldn't place where she had seen her before. The woman was tall, with long, dark hair and a soft, knowing smile. She was holding a small envelope in her hands. Sarah blinked, her throat dry. "Can I help you?" The woman's smile grew wider, but there was something different about it. Something more knowing. "I think you already know," the woman said, her voice soft but firm. "We need to talk." A chill ran down Sarah's spine. "Who are you?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling despite herself. The weight of the question was too much. Could this woman somehow be connected to what had happened? Was she another version of that thing that had tormented her? "I'm not your reflection," the woman replied, her tone almost soothing. "But I was once like you. And now, it's time for you to understand the truth." Before Sarah could respond, the woman stepped forward, closing the distance between them in an instant, and gently pressed the envelope into Sarah's trembling hands. "There's more to this," the woman said, her eyes darkening with a mixture of sadness and resolve. "More than you've seen, more than you can imagine. The reflection isn't just a thing you can escape. It's part of something much bigger, and it's coming for you again." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She gripped the envelope tightly, her pulse racing. "What do you mean?" she demanded, voice barely above a whisper. I stopped it. I fought it. It's gone." The woman shook her head slowly, her face growing more somber. "You thought you stopped it, but it's never truly gone. It's part of a cycle, a pattern that repeats itself time and time again. And the reflection, it's only the beginning." Her stomach dropped. She didn't want to hear this. Didn't want to face that thing again. Didn't want to believe that it could come back. But the woman's eyes were filled with a certainty that made it impossible to ignore. "You need to understand what you're up against," the woman continued. "The reflection isn't just a curse, it's a force. It's part of something older, something darker. It thrives on the darkness within all of us, and it feeds on those who fear losing themselves. And when it comes back, it doesn't just take over, it creates more of its kind. It's like a virus. And when the cycle begins again, it's harder to stop." "Why are you telling me this?" Sarah whispered, her hand shaking as she gripped the envelope. "Because you're not alone in this. the woman said, stepping back and giving Sarah a long, intense look. You need to find the others. They'll help you, and together you can end this. For good. The weight of her words settled over Sarah like a cloud, heavy and suffocating. She wanted to run, to shut the door and pretend that this woman was just another trick of the reflection. But something inside her told her that wasn't the way forward. That wouldn't bring her the peace she was craving. The woman gave a small, final nod. The envelope will guide you. It's time to face what's next. You can't hide anymore. With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Sarah standing there, still holding the envelope. A deep sense of unease settled over Sarah. She looked at the envelope, hesitated, and then carefully opened it. Inside was a simple note, the handwriting sharp and precise. You're not done. Not yet. Find them. The words burned in her mind, a stark reminder that her journey wasn't over, that whatever had started with the mirror wasn't finished. She wasn't free. Not yet. Sarah stood there, holding the envelope, her mind racing. She could feel her pulse quicken as the words from the note echoed in her thoughts. You're not done. Not yet. Find them. Who were they? And what did it mean that she wasn't finished with the reflection? She had fought so hard, overcome so much to get free, and now this new revelation was pulling her back into the darkness. But there was something about the note, the woman, the urgency in the air. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The reflection wasn't just an isolated event. It was part of something larger, something more sinister. With a heavy sigh, she closed the door, the chill from the woman's words lingering in the air. She moved to her small kitchen, setting the envelope down on the counter with a trembling hand. The apartment felt too quiet again, too empty, like the calm before a storm. Her heart still hammered in her chest, her mind spinning with the implications of what she had just heard. The reflection wasn't gone. The woman had said it was a cycle, a force that would return, that had claimed others before her. But who were these others? And how could she stop something that was so much bigger than herself? Sarah rubbed her temples, trying to process everything. She could still feel the sting of the reflection's claws in her mind, its voice still echoing through her thoughts. You are me. I am you. She felt that pull again, that lingering presence, the taste of fear still lingering on her tongue. But no, she couldn't go back to that place. She refused to. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to focus on the envelope again. She needed to know what it meant, what the woman had wanted her to understand. Maybe the answers were inside. With trembling fingers, she slid the note out of the envelope. But this time, there was something else inside. A small, folded photograph. The paper was old, yellowed with age, and the edges were frayed. She unfolded it carefully. The photo was black and white, grainy, but clear enough to make out the faces of 4 people standing together. There was a woman with short dark hair, standing next to a man with glasses and a distant look in his eyes. A teenage girl stood beside them, arms crossed, looking sullen. And then there was a boy, younger than the others, with wide, innocent eyes, staring directly at the camera. They were all standing in front of a house that seemed oddly familiar. Her heart skipped a beat. That house. It was the house she had grown up in. The place she had left years ago, the place she had thought was lost to time. The house was different in the photograph, darker, more worn, but it was unmistakable. A sick feeling churned in Sarah's stomach. She knew these people. She had to. They were connected to the reflection somehow, but she couldn't remember how. The woman had mentioned finding them. But who were they? And why had she been drawn back to that house? Her thoughts were interrupted by a sharp knock at the door. The sound cut through the silence like a blade, sharp and sudden. It made her jump, her heart hammering in her chest again. She hadn't expected anyone, not after the woman had left. With shaky hands, Sarah moved toward the door, unsure of what she might find on the other side. Was it another trick? Another reflection? She hesitated, then opened it, her breath catching in her throat as she stared at the person standing there. A man, tall and lean, with dark hair that fell over his eyes. He wore a faded leather jacket, and his expression was tense, wary, but familiar. He had a certain haunted look about him, one that sent an involuntary shiver down her spine. He didn't look like anyone she knew, but somehow she knew him. It was as if her mind had already placed him there, among the people in the photograph, among the memories she couldn't quite reach. "Sarah," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "You need to come with me." She stepped back, confusion filling her. "Who are you?" The man's gaze flickered over her shoulder, as if checking the room behind her. He then fixed his eyes back on her. "I know what you're thinking. You're scared. You're not alone in this. You can't do this by yourself." His voice was steady, firm. "They're already watching you. You have to come now. It's not safe." Sarah felt her heart race again, her breath quickening. He was talking about the reflection, wasn't he? But how did he know? "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice shaking. "How do you know?" He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "I've been through it before. The reflection. It's not just your past haunting you, Sarah. It's something bigger, something ancient. You can't fight it alone. You have to meet the others. The others." The words from the note flooded back into her mind. Sarah felt a cold wave of dread wash over her. She looked at the man, his face a mixture of urgency and fear. He wasn't lying. She could see it in his eyes. He had been through this. He knew exactly what she was going through. "Why are you here?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He took a deep breath, his eyes darkening with what looked like sorrow. "Because it's time to face what's coming. It's time to stop running." She glanced at the photograph again. Her mind raced, the pieces beginning to fall into place. The house, the people in the photo, they were connected to this man, to the reflection, to everything she had tried to escape. But the questions still burned in her mind. What did it all mean? The man met her gaze, his eyes full of determination. "You can fight this, together, but you have to come with me. Now." Sarah stood there for a long moment, her mind torn between fear and a strange sense of duty. She had already fought once, but this wasn't just about her anymore. This was bigger than her, bigger than the reflection. Finally, with a slow, steady breath, she nodded. "Okay, I'll come." The man's expression softened, and for a moment, Sarah could see something human in him, something that made her feel like she wasn't entirely alone in this fight. He stepped aside, motioning for her to follow. "Then let's go." And with that, Sarah crossed the threshold, stepping into the unknown. Sarah followed the man, her footsteps heavy as she stepped out of her apartment and into the cold night air. The world felt different now, as if a veil had been lifted, revealing a truth she wasn't sure she was ready to face. The man, who hadn't told her his name yet, led the way without speaking, his long strides quick and purposeful. He glanced over his shoulder every few moments, his eyes scanning the street like a predator searching for danger. "Who are you?" Sarah asked again, her voice shaky as she tried to keep up with him. Her mind was still spinning, trying to piece together everything that had just happened: the woman, the note, the photo, and now this strange man. He didn't answer immediately, but after a long silence, he turned to her, his face softening just enough to show some trace of empathy. "I'm someone who's been through what you're facing," he said, his voice low but steady. "And I'm here to help you understand what's happening." They walked in silence for a few more blocks, the city's usual hustle and bustle feeling far away, distant, as though the world had shifted just out of reach. The only sounds are the echo of their footsteps and the occasional murmur of a car passing by. Finally, they reached an old, run-down building on the edge of town. It was a stark contrast to the surrounding city, a crumbling relic, almost as though it didn't belong here. The man stopped in front of the door, hesitating for a brief moment before he turned to Sarah. "This is where it all starts," he said, his voice quieter now. "The house. It's not just a place. It's a key." Sarah's heart stuttered in her chest. The house, the same one from the photograph. This was where it all began. But why here? Why now? "What do you mean, a key?" Sarah asked, her mind racing. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were standing at the edge of something much darker, something much more dangerous than she had ever imagined. The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he pushed the door open, revealing a dimly lit hallway that seemed to stretch endlessly. The air inside was thick, damp, and smelled of mildew and old wood. The house felt alive, almost as if it was breathing, its creaking floorboards groaning in protest as they entered. "This is where the reflection started," the man said, his voice tinged with something that almost sounded like regret. "We've been running from it for a long time. We were hoping you'd never have to come back here. But here we are." Sarah stepped into the house, feeling a deep sense of unease settle over her. The walls seemed to whisper, the sound barely audible, like an echo from the past, a voice she couldn't quite understand. It was as if the house itself was haunted by memories of things that hadn't happened yet. As they made their way deeper into the building, Sarah's thoughts returned to the photo, to the people she didn't fully recognize but somehow knew. The woman, the man, the girl, and the boy. She couldn't place them, but she felt an undeniable connection to them. Had they been here before? Had they gone through the same thing she was now facing? They reached a door at the end of the hallway. The man hesitated again, his hand hovering over the handle. "This is where we..." He stopped mid-sentence and glanced over his shoulder, as though sensing something. Sarah followed his gaze, but there was nothing in the dimly lit hallway. Still, she felt it, a shift in the air, a presence just beyond her line of sight. "Something's wrong," the man muttered, his voice low and tense. "We're not alone." Before Sarah could react, the door behind them slammed shut with a deafening bang. The room grew colder, the temperature dropping sharply, causing Sarah to shiver involuntarily. The man turned to face her, his eyes wide with alarm. "Stay close," he warned, his voice tight with urgency. "This is what I was afraid of. It's here." Suddenly, the air seemed to ripple around them. The walls of the house warped, shifting as though reality itself was bending, pulling them into something darker, something more sinister. Then, a low, guttural laugh echoed from the darkness. It was the reflection, its voice now twisted and distorted, coming from every direction at once. "You can't run from me, Sarah." The reflection purred, its tone dripping with malice. "You belong to me. You always have." Sarah's heart clenched in her chest, panic rising as the world around her seemed to dissolve into shadows. She instinctively reached for the man's hand, but it was already too late. The reflection had found them. The man grabbed her arm, his grip tight and unyielding. "We can't fight it here," he said, his voice strained. "We need to get out now." But the reflection wasn't giving up. Its form began to take shape, its twisted figure materializing out of the shadows. Sarah could feel its cold eyes on her, could hear its mocking laughter echoing in her mind. "Don't listen to it," the man growled, pulling Sarah toward a narrow staircase that led further down into the house. "This is where it all ends. Sarah, you need to remember who you are. You need to fight." They reached the bottom of the stairs, and the air grew even colder, the shadows pressing in around them. At the far end of the room, Sarah could make out a faint light, a flicker of warmth that seemed to beckon to her. The man pulled her toward it, his eyes filled with urgency. The reflection's laughter echoed again, louder this time, reverberating off the walls like 1,000 voices speaking in unison. "You mind, Sarah? You're never getting out." Sarah squeezed her eyes shut, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The man's voice broke through the chaos, sharp and steady. "You have to fight. You're stronger than this. Remember what you saw. Remember who you are." For a moment, everything fell silent. The shadows seemed to retreat, and the reflection's voice faded into the distance. Sarah's heart raced, but she forced herself to focus, to remember. And then, as if on instinct, she turned to face the darkness, her mind clearing. "I'm not you," she thought, her voice firm in her mind. "I'm not yours. I never will be." The reflection screamed, a sound of pure rage, but it didn't touch her. For the first time, Sarah felt the power within her, the strength she had been fighting to hold on to. And for the first time, she knew she could win. The room around Sarah felt different now, the oppressive weight of the reflection's presence retreating ever so slightly as she focused on the growing strength inside her. Her breath steadied, her mind clearing like a fog lifting. She wasn't sure how she knew it, but she could feel it. This was the moment where she could fight back. The man beside her seemed to sense the change, his grip on her arm loosening slightly. "That's it," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper, but full of conviction. "You're not just fighting the reflection. You're fighting yourself." She glanced at him, confusion flickering in her eyes. What did he mean? She was fighting the reflection, wasn't she? The twisted version of her, the thing that had tormented her for so long. The man's eyes softened, but his expression was still serious. "You don't just face the reflection in the mirror, Sarah. You face what's inside. The fear, the doubt, the parts of you that you've pushed away. That's where the reflection thrives. But you can control it. You always could." Her mind raced, trying to make sense of his words. She had fought the reflection before, pushed it back when it had tried to drag her into that dark, empty world. But he was right. She had been running from it. From herself. From the weakness, the fear, the things she didn't want to acknowledge. The reflection fed on that, twisted it into something more horrifying, more powerful. But now, in the face of it, she wasn't going to run anymore. The reflection's laughter rang out once more, this time mocking, knowing. "You think you've won?" It jeered, its voice coming from every direction. "You're nothing but a shadow of who you could be. I am your truth. You'll never escape me." Sarah's heart pounded, but her resolve only grew stronger. "No," she said, her voice firm, carrying through the room. "You're not me. You never were." As she spoke the words, the shadows seemed to recoil, as though her defiance was a light burning away the darkness. The temperature in the room shifted, a warmth spreading from her chest, her hands filling the space around her. The reflection, momentarily stunned, hesitated. It wasn't used to this kind of resistance. "I'm not afraid of you anymore," Sarah whispered, her voice growing louder. "I won't let you control me." The reflection screeched in fury, its form warping, shifting, becoming more grotesque with every passing second. But Sarah stood firm, the strength inside her surging with each word, with each thought she cast aside. She could feel the man beside her, his presence like a silent anchor, his words from before ringing in her ears. "You're not alone in this. You can fight." She focused on the warmth that was now radiating through her, pulling it up from deep within, letting it surge to the surface. The house around her seemed to shift in response, the walls pulsing with the energy she was creating. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for everything the reflection had taken from her, the peace, the freedom, the control. With a final, deep breath, Sarah raised her hands toward the darkness. She said, her voice filled with certainty, "And I'm not going to let you win." The air around her crackled with energy. The reflection screamed, its form starting to dissolve, but it wasn't over yet. It lashed out, trying to pull her back into the darkness, trying to drag her into that familiar, suffocating void. But Sarah was ready. With a force she didn't even know she had, she thrust her hands forward, and the light she had summoned surged outward. The reflection recoiled as the light ripped through the shadows, unraveling it, stripping it away like peeling layers of rotting flesh. The air felt heavy, then lighter, as the reflection began to fragment, breaking apart into thousands of tiny pieces, each one dissolving into nothingness. The man beside her stepped back, watching in awe as Sarah stood firm, holding the light. His eyes softened with something that resembled admiration. "You've done it," he said quietly. "You've broken the cycle." Sarah's chest heaved with exhaustion, her energy nearly depleted. But she felt a strange sense of relief, as though she had just released a burden she had carried for too long. The reflection's voice faded completely, leaving only silence in its wake. She looked around, seeing the room now fully illuminated, the shadows no longer twisting or moving. The house felt still, like the weight of it had been lifted. But there was no time to relax, no time to savor the victory. She could feel it, this wasn't the end. The reflection might be gone for now, but the cycle wasn't over. She had broken free for this moment, but there was more to do. The man, watching her closely, gave a small nod. "It's over. For now. But the others will be coming. The ones like you, the ones who've seen it too." "Others?" Sarah asked, her voice tired but determined. He didn't respond immediately, his gaze distant, as though considering something deeper. Finally, he turned back to her, his expression grim. You're not the first to face this, and you won't be the last. But you've learned what you needed to. You're ready now. A cold shiver ran down Sarah's spine as she realized the gravity of his words. There were others like her, who had gone through this same fight. And the reflection, or whatever it was, wasn't finished yet. We'll need to find them, she said, her voice strong despite the weariness settling in her bones. The man nodded. We will, but you're not alone in this anymore. Together, we'll stop it. We have to. And as they turned to leave the house, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The battle wasn't over, but she was no longer afraid. As Sarah stepped out of the house, she felt the weight of the night pressing in around her. The city seemed quieter now, the streets empty, almost deserted. The air was thick with the remnants of the battle she had just fought, the residue of the reflection still hanging in the corners of her mind. But she was different now, stronger. The man, who had yet to tell her his name, walked beside her, his pace steady and unhurried. They didn't speak for a while, the silence between them comfortable in its own way. Sarah's mind was still reeling, trying to piece everything together. What had happened? How had she summoned that power? And why had the reflection let her win, if only for this moment? Are you okay? The man asked finally, breaking the silence. Sarah nodded, though she didn't feel okay. Her body ached with exhaustion, and her head throbbed, the remnants of the darkness still lingering in her thoughts. I think so, she replied. But what now? You said the others would come. What does that mean? The man glanced at her, his eyes somber. It means we need to find them, and fast. The reflection, it doesn't just affect one person at a time. It spreads. It finds those who are vulnerable, those who have faced it before, and it uses them. We have to stop the cycle, Sarah. If we don't, it will keep coming back. Her heart sank. It wasn't over. The reflection was still out there, waiting, and it would keep finding new victims until they stopped it for good. But why me? Sarah asked, her voice quiet but filled with urgency. Why am I the one who can stop it? The man paused, as though considering his words carefully. I don't know exactly, but I think it has something to do with your connection to the house, the place where the reflection first took hold. You're tied to it, your past. It's part of the reason why it keeps coming for you. But you also have something it can't control. You broke free, Sarah. You were able to push it back. That's something others haven't been able to do. Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine at the thought. The house, her past, the reflection, it had all been connected to the dark memories she had tried to forget. But now, she realized those memories might be the key to defeating it once and for all. They reached the edge of town, where the buildings began to thin out and the streets grew quieter. The man led her toward an old, abandoned factory on the outskirts, its metal gates rusted and locked. This is where we're meeting the others, he explained, his voice steady. They'll know what to do next. As they approached the factory, Sarah couldn't help but feel a creeping sense of dread. She didn't know what to expect from these others the man had mentioned. Were they like her? Had they been touched by the reflection, too? The man reached into his pocket and pulled out a key, a large, tarnished iron key that seemed far too old for the lock it was meant to open. With a quick, practiced turn, the gate creaked open, revealing a narrow path leading into the factory. The man gestured for Sarah to follow. Inside, the factory was vast and empty, the floors covered in dust, the machinery long abandoned. The air was thick with the smell of rust and decay, and the only sound was the echo of their footsteps. How many others are there? Sarah asked as they walked through the cavernous space. 3, the man replied. Maybe 4. They're all different, but they've all seen the reflection, and they've all struggled with it in their own ways. They'll know what to do next. They reached the center of the factory, where a large, broken-down machine sat in the middle of the room, its metal frame jagged and torn. But it wasn't the machine that caught Sarah's attention. It was the figures standing around it, waiting for them. There were 4 of them, 2 men and 2 women. Each one looked weary, worn, but there was a fire in their eyes, a shared understanding. They had all been through the same thing. The man who had brought Sarah here stepped forward and nodded at them. "This is Sarah," he said, his voice carrying through the silence. "She's one of us now." One of the women, a tall, dark-haired woman with piercing green eyes, stepped forward, her gaze sharp. "You're the one who fought it," she said, her voice low and steady. "The reflection. You pushed it back. We've been waiting for someone like you." Sarah swallowed hard, her throat dry. "I don't know how I did it. It just happened. But You don't need to explain," the woman interrupted. "We've all been there. We've all fought it. It's not about how you did it. It's about what comes next. The reflection, Sarah, it's never just one battle. It's a war, and we need all the help we can get." The man who had brought Sarah here stepped back, allowing her to face the others. "Sarah," he said softly, "this is the team. We can stop it. Together." For the first time in a long while, Sarah felt a flicker of hope. She wasn't alone anymore. She had found others who understood, others who had been through the same nightmare. "How do we stop it?" Sarah asked, her voice steady despite the fear that still lingered in her chest. The woman with the green eyes smiled, though it was a grim expression. "We find the source. The reflection doesn't just feed on fear. It thrives on the darkness in all of us. We need to find where it's coming from and destroy it." "But how do we do that?" Sarah asked, her voice filled with doubt. "We've tried before, haven't we? I've tried to get rid of it." The man who had been silent until now, a thin, wiry figure with deep-set eyes, spoke up. "It's not about getting rid of it, Sarah. It's about understanding it. We don't destroy it in the way you're thinking. We contain it. We lock it away where it can't do any more harm." Sarah looked at them all, uncertainty clouding her mind. Could she trust them? Could she trust that this was the answer? The woman with the green eyes stepped closer, her gaze softening. "You've already faced it. You've already fought it. And now, you're ready for the next step." Sarah looked at each of them, the weight of their words settling in her chest. She didn't have all the answers. She didn't know how she had gotten this far, but she did know one thing. She wasn't going to let the reflection win. She was going to fight. And this time, she wasn't fighting alone. The tension in the air was thick as Sarah stood before the group, her mind racing with everything she'd just learned. The reflection wasn't just a battle to be won. It was a war, a cycle that had been playing out for far too long. She wasn't just fighting her own darkness. She was fighting something ancient, something that thrived on fear and despair. And somehow, she had become part of it. But now, with these people, these survivors, she had a chance to end it once and for all. "Where do we start?" Sarah asked, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside her. The woman with green eyes nodded, taking a step forward. "We have to find its origin. The reflection is more than just a manifestation. It's tied to something bigger, something ancient. We know it feeds on the people who've seen it, the ones it chooses, but it also needs a place, a focal point. The house you came from, that's where it all started." Sarah shivered at the mention of the house, the one she had left behind, the one that had haunted her thoughts ever since she was a child. The house wasn't just a building, it was a prison that had kept the reflection alive. "Why me?" Sarah asked, her voice low. "Why did it choose me? Why not any of you?" The woman with green eyes exchanged a glance with the others before she spoke again. "You have a connection to it, Sarah. A deep one. You've always had it, even if you didn't realize it. The reflection knows you. It knows your fear, your pain. It's been feeding off it for years. But now, you've shown that you're capable of fighting it. That makes you different. It makes you strong. And you're not the only one." Sarah frowned. "What do you mean? I'm not the only one." The man who had brought her here, the one who had been silent for the most part, stepped forward. His eyes were full of experience, his voice heavy with the weight of everything they had been through. "There are others, Sarah. The reflection doesn't just go after people randomly. It picks those who have a history with it, those who've faced it before. You've already experienced its power. That's why it chose you." A chill ran down Sarah's spine. The reflection had come for her before. It had haunted her, twisted her memories, forced her to confront the worst parts of herself. But she had pushed through it. She had survived. Now, she had to finish what she had started. "So what's the plan?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling but determined. "How do we stop it?" The woman with green eyes looked around at the group, her expression resolute. We need to return to the house. We need to find the source of the reflection's power and destroy it. But we can't do it alone. We'll need to face the reflection head on. But we also need to prepare for its tricks. It'll try to lure us in, deceive us. It knows our fears, our weaknesses. We have to be stronger than it. The wiry man with deep-set eyes spoke up again, his voice quiet but firm. We've trained for this. We've all faced it in different ways, and we've all learned how to fight. Together, we're stronger. But this isn't something we can rush. We need to gather our strength and make sure we're ready. The reflection will wait for the right moment to strike. It's patient. It always is. Sarah nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew what was at stake. The reflection wasn't just a threat to her. It was a threat to everyone. To anyone who had ever encountered it. And if she didn't stop it now, it would keep spreading. It would keep feeding on fear and darkness until there was nothing left. We'll need to move fast, she said, her voice filled with resolve. The longer we wait, the stronger it gets. We can't give it time to regroup. The woman with the green eyes smiled, a flicker of respect in her gaze. That's the spirit. But we also need to be careful. The house is a trap, Sarah. It's not just a building, it's a place of power. The reflection will use it against us, turn it into something we can't fight. Sarah's stomach twisted at the thought. The house had always been a place of terror in her mind. But now, she had no choice but to face it, to confront the very thing that had haunted her for years. Do you think we can destroy it? Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The woman nodded slowly. I think we can, but it won't be easy. The reflection is a part of that house. We can't just burn it down and expect it to go away. We need to sever the connection, destroy the link between the house and the reflection. Once we do that, it won't be able to use that place as its anchor anymore. The man who had been silent earlier spoke again, his voice filled with a quiet urgency. We'll need to act fast. The longer we wait, the more power the reflection gains. It will try to trap us there. We have to be prepared for anything. The group stood in a circle, each of them looking at one another with a sense of shared purpose. Sarah felt a surge of gratitude for these strangers who had become allies in the fight against the darkness. Together, they had a chance to end this, to stop the reflection from spreading its reach further. The wiry man stepped forward. We'll head out first thing in the morning. Rest up. We'll need all our strength for what's to come. The others nodded in agreement. The factory was silent again, the weight of their mission hanging heavy in the air. As Sarah turned to leave, the woman with green eyes caught her arm, her touch light but firm. You ready for this, Sarah? I know you are. Don't doubt yourself. Sarah met her gaze, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and hope. The reflection was still out there, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she had a chance. And this time, she wasn't going to let it win. As they left the factory in the night, air closed in around them. Sarah's mind swirled with thoughts of the house. The memories, the darkness, the reflection, it all led back to that place. But now, she had a new purpose. She wasn't running anymore. She was going to face the reflection and put an end to it. The night passed uneventfully, though Sarah's rest was fitful. Her mind churned with thoughts of the house, the reflection, and the fight that lay ahead. She hadn't realized how deeply the past had been buried inside her, how much it had shaped who she was until now. The reflection had been feeding off those fears, those memories, turning them into something monstrous. And now she had to face it all again. At dawn, the group gathered outside the factory, each of them looking weary but determined. The man who had brought Sarah here handed her a small, weathered backpack. You'll need this, he said, his voice steady. We don't know what we'll find in the house. You'll need supplies. Sarah nodded, slipping the pack over her shoulder. The weight of it felt symbolic. She wasn't just carrying tools. She was carrying her resolve, her readiness to face the nightmare she had been running from for so long. They set off toward the house, the distance between the factory and the old building stretching out like an eternity. The road to the house was familiar to Sarah, though it felt strange now, as though the memories of the place were shifting, warping in the light of what she had learned. The house loomed in the distance, just as dark and foreboding as it had always been. The group walked in silence, their footsteps heavy on the dirt road. The air was thick with anticipation, the weight of what was to come hanging over them like a storm cloud. As they reached the house, Sarah felt a coldness settle over her. The house seemed different now, more alive somehow. It was as though the walls themselves were watching her, waiting. Waiting for what? For her to return? For her to break the cycle? Or for her to fail? "This is it," the woman with the green eyes said, her voice low but resolute. "We need to be careful. The reflection will be stronger here, more unpredictable. It'll use everything it can to turn us against each other." Sarah nodded, her eyes fixed on the door. It was just like she remembered. Old, rotting wood, a rusted doorknob that had been untouched for years. It was a symbol of everything that had been buried, hidden in the past. And now it was time to face it. The man who had brought Sarah here stepped forward and pushed the door open. It creaked loudly, the sound echoing through the empty air. The smell of mildew and dust wafted out, the staleness of years left unchecked. As they stepped inside, the house felt even colder, the air thick with something oppressive. Sarah's heart began to race, the familiar anxiety creeping up her spine. She had been here before. She had walked through these rooms, trying to escape the reflection, trying to outrun the darkness that had clung to her since childhood. "Stay close," the wiry man advised, his voice low and steady as he led the way. "The reflection won't play by any rules. Don't let it trick you." The others nodded in agreement, their faces grim. Sarah couldn't help but notice the tension in their eyes, the fear that had never truly left them. They had faced the reflection before, and they knew how dangerous it could be. The group moved through the house cautiously, their footsteps echoing on the creaky wooden floorboards. Sarah's eyes darted from room to room, searching for any sign of movement, any hint that the reflection was waiting for them. The house was empty, but felt far from abandoned. It felt alive, as though it had been waiting for them to return. They reached the living room, the same room where Sarah had seen the reflection for the first time. The walls were cracked, the furniture covered in dust. But as Sarah stepped forward, a chill ran down her spine. The mirror on the wall, the same mirror that had started it all, was intact. "You know what to do," the woman with the green eyes said, her voice steady. "It's time to face it." Sarah's hands shook as she reached out, her fingers brushing the surface of the mirror. The reflection stared back at her, its eyes dark and knowing, a twisted version of herself, distorted and hungry. "You think you can stop me?" the reflection hissed, its voice low and mocking. "You'll never be free. You belong to me." Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she took a step back, but the others were already moving. They had been here before. They had faced the reflection, and now they were ready to end it. Together, the wiry man said, his voice fierce. "We fight together." The group closed ranks around Sarah, each of them standing tall, their eyes fixed on the reflection. The woman with green eyes stepped forward, raising her hands. A faint glow started to radiate from her palms, and the reflection recoiled, its form flickering like a shadow in the light. "This is your end," the woman said, her voice calm but firm. "You will not control us anymore." The reflection screeched, its form distorting, shifting between images of terror, showing each of them their darkest fears. But Sarah was ready. She had faced this before, and now she had something it couldn't take away. She raised her hand, and a surge of warmth spread from deep within her, just like before. It wasn't just the light of power, it was the light of understanding, of self-acceptance. The reflection could no longer feed off her fear, her doubts. She was stronger than that now. She knew what she had to do. The woman with green eyes nodded at Sarah. "Now, Sarah, now." With one final push, Sarah focused all her energy on the reflection. She wasn't just fighting to defeat it. She was fighting to free herself, to break the chains that had bound her for so long. The mirror shattered with a deafening crack, the sound reverberating through the house. The reflection screamed, its form splintering into 1,000 pieces, each one fading into nothingness. The room fell silent. Sarah stood panting, her body trembling from the effort, But the weight of the reflection's presence was gone. The house felt lighter, the oppressive air lifting. "It's over," the woman with green eyes said softly, a look of relief in her eyes. "It's finally over." The others nodded, exhaustion etched on their faces, but there was a new light in their eyes. They had done it. Together, they had stopped the reflection, once and for all. Sarah looked around at them, her heart swelling with gratitude. She wasn't alone anymore. And the reflection? It was gone. Gone for good. For the first time in years, Sarah felt the burden lift from her shoulders. The reflection was no longer a part of her. And the house, it was no longer a prison. It was just a house. Empty. Forgotten. And Sarah was free. The silence in the room was almost deafening. Sarah stood in the middle of the wrecked living room, staring at the remnants of the shattered mirror. The pieces lay scattered across the floor like shards of a broken reality, reflecting nothing but emptiness now. For the first time in years, Sarah could breathe without the suffocating weight of the reflection pressing down on her chest. She wasn't sure whether to feel relief, awe, or something more profound, a sense of freedom, one she hadn't dared to hope for. But the victory was only temporary. "We did it," the wiry man said, his voice hoarse but filled with a kind of exhausted triumph. He wiped his forehead with the back of his hand, leaving a streak of sweat in his wake. "Yes," the woman with green eyes murmured, her gaze sweeping the room as though verifying that everything was truly over. But the reflection isn't just something you can defeat outright. It's a cycle, a force. It will try to find a way back. We need to make sure it stays gone. Sarah's heart skipped a beat at the thought. She had been so sure that destroying the mirror, shattering the source of the reflection's power, would be enough. But she had been wrong. The house might have been rid of the reflection, but something in the woman's tone told Sarah that the danger wasn't entirely over. "What do we do now?" Sarah asked, her voice unsteady. The green-eyed woman met her gaze, her expression unreadable. "Now we burn it." The word hit Sarah like a thunderclap. "Burn it?" she repeated, her heart suddenly hammering in her chest. "You mean the house? We have to destroy it." The man who had led her here nodded gravely. "Yes, the house holds more than just memories. It's a conduit, a bridge. If we leave it standing, there's a chance the reflection could rise again, even from the smallest remnants." Sarah felt a wave of nausea hit her. The house had been a prison, yes, but it was also a part of her. The place where her past had been shaped, where her nightmares had been born. It wasn't just a building, it was a part of who she was. Could she really destroy it? "It has to be done," the green-eyed woman said, sensing Sarah's hesitation. "If you leave even a fragment of it standing, it will come back. And a reflection isn't just your enemy. It's anyone who's ever encountered it. It will use this place to rise again, to latch onto new victims, to continue its cycle. We can't let that happen." Sarah swallowed hard, her gaze locked on the cracked floor beneath her. Her mind screamed against it, but her heart knew the truth. It wasn't just the reflection that had caused her pain, it was the house itself. The memories, the darkness, the feeling of being trapped. It all began here. It had to end here. "Okay," Sarah said finally, her voice small but steady. "We burn it." The woman with green eyes nodded in approval, and the group began to move toward the door. As they exited the house, Sarah glanced back one last time, her breath catching in her throat. The house stood there, looming against the sky, its dark silhouette casting a long shadow in the fading light. It looked harmless now, but Sarah knew better. The house wasn't just a building. It was the final piece of the puzzle, the last link that connected her to the reflection, and it had to be destroyed. They walked in silence, heading toward the trees at the edge of the property where the man had set up a small, makeshift campsite earlier. There, they gathered what little they had in the way of tools and materials. Gasoline, matches, anything to ensure the flames would reach the heart of the house, to burn it down to the ground. It didn't take long to prepare. Sarah stood back, her chest tight, as the others doused the wooden structure with gasoline, the scent of fuel mixing with the crisp evening air. The smell was overpowering, almost suffocating, but it was necessary. The fire would purify everything. The house would be gone, and with it, the last remnants of the reflection. "You ready?" the wiry man asked, his voice low. Sarah nodded. She wasn't sure if she was ready, but this was the only way forward. The only way to ensure that the reflection would never come back. "Do it," she said, her voice breaking as she fought to steady herself. The green-eyed woman took a deep breath, then struck a match and tossed it onto the fuel-soaked ground. The fire caught immediately, roaring to life with a violent hiss. The flames leaped toward the sky, bright and furious, consuming everything in their path. For a moment, Sarah stood frozen, watching the fire spread across the house. The sound of crackling would fill the air, the flames licking at the structure, tearing through the walls, devouring the memories, the darkness, the reflection itself. And as the house began to collapse, Sarah felt a weight lift from her chest. A burden she hadn't realized she was still carrying was finally gone. The past, the fear, the reflection, it was all burning away. "Is it over now?" Sarah asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. The green-eyed woman nodded solemnly, her gaze fixed on the inferno. "Yes, it's over." But as Sarah watched the house burn, a faint unease tugged at her gut. It wasn't fear, but something else. A realization. The reflection had been stopped, yes, but it wasn't just a part of the house. It had been inside her too. The memories, the pain, the trauma. It had all been feeding off of her for years. She could destroy the house, but the battle wasn't just physical. It was within her as well. "How do we know it's really gone?" Sarah asked, her voice small but filled with uncertainty. The green-eyed woman glanced at her, her expression softening. "It's gone, Sarah." The reflection was tied to the house, to the place where your fear took root. It's gone, and so are the chains that held around you. But the battle to stay free? That's up to you. You're stronger than it now. You're free. Sarah took a deep breath, looking at the smoldering ruins of the house. The reflection had tried to break her. It had tried to control her. But now she had won. She wasn't that broken, fearful person anymore. She was free. For the first time in her life, she believed it. The flames from the burning house crackled and roared in the distance, casting a flickering light on the faces of those gathered around the camp. The air was heavy with the scent of burning wood and charred memories. But there was something else too, a feeling of quiet relief, mixed with a lingering sense of uncertainty. Sarah stood with her arms crossed, staring at the fire as it consumed the remnants of the house. The once feared building, the source of her nightmares, was now nothing more than a collapsing heap of embers. "You've done it," the wiry man said quietly, his voice tinged with respect. "It's gone." Sarah didn't respond immediately. She couldn't. Her mind was still processing everything, the house, the reflection, the years of fear that had been tied to it all. But now that it was gone, she felt different, lighter almost. And yet, there was an odd emptiness that lingered at the edge of her thoughts, like a piece of her past had been irrevocably erased. The green-eyed woman stood beside Sarah, her expression thoughtful. It's natural to feel lost after something like this. The reflection was a part of you, Sarah. It shaped you in ways you couldn't understand. But you're free now. The real question is, what will you do with that freedom? Sarah turned to look at her, her brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" The woman said, her voice quiet but firm, "You've been fighting this thing for so long, trying to get rid of it, that it's easy to forget that it's been a part of your identity. You're not just letting go of the reflection, you're letting go of a piece of yourself. And now you have to figure out who you are without it." Sarah felt a pang in her chest, a tightness that spread throughout her ribs. It was true. The reflection had been her shadow, her constant companion, even when she didn't realize it. It had shaped her thoughts, her actions, her fear. And now that it was gone, she had to confront the emptiness that followed. Who was she without the reflection? Without the trauma that had bound her to that house for so long? "I don't know," Sarah said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I spent my whole life running from this thing. Now that it's gone, I'm not sure who I am anymore." The woman with green eyes gave her a knowing look, her gaze soft but understanding. "That's okay. You don't have to have all the answers right now. You've been through something unimaginable, and it's going to take time to process. Just don't let the absence of the reflection define you. You're more than that. Sarah nodded slowly, but a new wave of unease washed over her. The reflection may have been gone, but a deeper, more subtle question remained. What next? She hadn't really considered the future before. All her thoughts had been consumed by the fight by survival. Now, with that battle behind her, she was left with a quiet void, a space that felt unfamiliar, almost daunting. The wiry man sat down on a fallen log, pulling out a flask and taking a swig. "You'll figure out, Sarah," he said, his tone gentle but firm. "You're strong, stronger than any of us realized." Sarah glanced at him, offering a small smile. She appreciated his words, but the road ahead felt uncertain. How could she move forward when so much of her past had been shaped by fear? How could she reclaim a sense of purpose when the thing she had spent so many years fighting was finally gone? She looked up at the stars, their faint light twinkling in the dark sky above. The fire crackled beside her, and for the first time, Sarah felt the warmth of it without the sense of dread she'd once associated with everything in her life. "We're free," she whispered to herself, the weight of those words finally sinking in. "We're really free." But deep in the pit of her stomach, something still gnawed at her. The reflection may have been destroyed, but there was something she couldn't shake. A feeling that she hadn't faced her darkest fear yet, the one that wasn't tied to the house, or the reflection, or the past. It was the fear of herself. As Sarah continued to stare into the fire, she realized that the real challenge wasn't destroying the reflection. It was learning to live without it. The fear, the self-doubt, the haunting memories were gone, but they had left behind a scar. The battle inside her wasn't over. It had just shifted. The green-eyed woman's words echoed in Sarah's mind. "You're more than that." The reflection had been a mirror of everything she had feared, everything she had believed about herself. It had shaped her, yes, but it didn't define her. She wasn't just a survivor of the reflection. She was someone who had faced her fears head-on and emerged from the darkness stronger than ever. It was time to embrace that strength, to stop letting the fear of what came next control her. "Let's go," Sarah said, her voice clear and firm now. She turned to the group, a sense of purpose returning to her. "We've done what we came to do. Let's move forward, together." The others nodded, some with visible relief, others with quiet respect. They had been through the same battle, fought the same demons. They had all lost something, but they had gained something too: strength, solidarity, and, most importantly, the knowledge that they could overcome anything. The fire burned low, the house reduced to nothing more than ash. But Sarah was no longer trapped by the past. She wasn't the woman she had been when she first set foot in that house. She was someone new, someone who had fought back against her demons and won. And now, she was ready to face whatever came next. As the group gathered their things and walked away from the fire, Sarah felt a sense of peace settle over her. The world was wide open now, filled with possibility. It wasn't the end of the journey, it was only the beginning. The night air felt fresh as it wrapped around Sarah and the group, the soft whisper of the wind through the trees like a lullaby after the chaos of the fire. As they walked away from the ruins of the house, the world seemed quieter, more expansive, as if the very landscape had been transformed by the destruction of the place that had held them all captive, physically and mentally. They trekked in silence, the only sounds now the crunch of dirt beneath their boots and the distant call of an owl in the trees. Sarah found herself lost in her thoughts, the events of the last few days running through her mind like a movie on fast forward. She hadn't had time to process everything. Not the house burning down, not the group of strangers who had helped her, and certainly not the fact that the reflection was truly gone. She had only had moments of clarity between the fear and the fighting. The green-eyed woman, whose name Sarah still didn't know, walked alongside her. She had been quiet since they left the fire, her gaze fixed ahead, her mind clearly elsewhere. "You've been through so much," Sarah said quietly, glancing over at her. "I don't know what to say. I don't even know how to thank you." The woman stopped walking for a moment, her long, dark hair swaying gently in the breeze as she turned to Sarah. She studied her for a second, as though weighing her words. "You don't have to thank me," she said softly. "This wasn't about saving you. It was about giving you the tools to save yourself. You did that." Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine at the weight of those words. It wasn't about saving her. It had never been about that. It had always been about her confronting the darkness inside, facing the reflection, the trauma, and finding a way to walk away from it, to build something new. The woman gave a small, almost imperceptible smile before turning her attention back to the path ahead. The others had already begun to walk a little faster, leading the way toward a distant road that would take them out of the woods and back into civilization. "What happens now?" Sarah asked. "What do we do next?" The woman's gaze softened. "That depends on you. But know this, there will always be more. Life doesn't just stop after one victory. The reflection was a part of you, yes, but it was also a part of something larger. There are more forces, darker things that linger just outside of what we can see. The fear you've been carrying? It's one of many kinds. And there's more work to do, both for you and for others who are trapped by their own shadows." Sarah felt a tightening in her chest. More? More shadows? The weight of everything that had happened already felt like enough to carry. Yet she knew the woman was right. This battle wasn't the last. The world wasn't as simple as a clean slate after a fight. The wiry man, leading the group, turned back toward them, his voice cutting through the night stillness. "We're close to the road. I think it's time to part ways." "Part ways?" Sarah asked, her heart sinking a little. She had been so focused on the house, on the reflection, that she hadn't thought about the people who had helped her along the way. They weren't just strangers. They were people who had shared this fight, had been through the same hell. The wiry man nodded. "We've done what we came here for. You've got your freedom now, Sarah, and that's something you need to find on your own. The rest of us, we've got our own paths to walk. We'll be there if you ever need us, but it's time for you to find your own way." He didn't say it like a dismissal, but rather as though it was a fact of life, something that needed to happen. The green-eyed woman's eyes met Sarah's once again, this time with an intensity that felt almost like a silent promise. "You're ready," the woman said simply. "You've got the strength to walk your path now. Just remember, you're never truly alone. You've already proven that." The words lingered in the air long after they had turned and started walking toward the road. Sarah stood still for a moment, watching them go, a rush of emotions swelling inside her. She didn't know how she felt about being left behind, about having to face the world on her own after all this time. But as she looked out into the wilderness ahead, at the winding road that would lead her back to normal life, she realized something profound. She had faced the reflection. She had survived. And now, the rest of her journey, whatever it might be, was hers to choose. The next few days were a blur for Sarah. She made her way back to civilization, but the world seemed different now. The streets felt unfamiliar, almost distant, as if she had been gone for a lifetime. She returned to her apartment, unpacked the few belongings she had, and tried to reclaim a semblance of normalcy. But something lingered, gnawing at her. The silence of her apartment wasn't peaceful. It felt oppressive. It felt like a mirror, a reflection of the emptiness inside her. The house had been destroyed, but the feeling of being unmoored, adrift in a world without the reflection's constant pull, was unsettling. Sarah spent hours staring at her own face in the mirror, searching for something, anything, that felt like the person she used to be. The one who had been afraid. The one who had been a victim of the house and the reflection. But there was nothing. She didn't recognize herself anymore. It took time, but little by little, Sarah started to rebuild. She found small ways to fill the space that had once been dominated by fear. She took up painting, something she had always loved, but never had the courage to pursue. She started journaling, recording her thoughts and feelings, untangling the web of emotions that had been tangled for so long. And in the quiet moments, she realized something important. Freedom wasn't just about escaping the reflection. It was about creating something new from the ashes of what had been. It was about finding peace with who she had become. And for the first time in a long time, She began to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could make it. Months passed, and Sarah's life began to shift in ways she hadn't anticipated. She had returned to a routine, something that, in her darkest moments, she had never thought possible. But with each day that passed, she felt a little less haunted by her past, a little more like the person she was meant to be. The apartment, once a tomb of memories and fear, now felt like her sanctuary. She had rearranged the furniture, added new artwork to the walls, and replaced the heavy curtains with light, sheer ones that allowed sunlight to stream in during the day. Slowly, she turned the space into something that felt like hers, untouched by the reflection, untouched by the house that had once defined her existence. But there were moments, fleeting and elusive, when Sarah would look up from her painting or from her journal and catch herself staring into the mirror again. The same mirror that had once reflected the thing that had controlled her every thought. But now, when she gazed into it, she didn't feel fear. She felt a strange mix of curiosity and emptiness, as though there was still something she hadn't fully processed. That sense of unfinished business began to gnaw at her, and it was on one particularly quiet evening, as she sat at her desk, the pale glow of her desk lamp casting shadows around the room, that she realized something. The reflection might have been gone, but the scars it left were still there. They weren't visible, no marks on her skin, no bruises to show the world, but they were present in her thoughts, in the way she looked at herself, at her own life, in the way she sometimes felt like a ghost walking through a world that had never quite felt real to her. One evening, as the wind howled outside her window, Sarah sat on her couch, flipping through an old photo album. There were pictures of her as a child, her family gathered at parks, at birthday parties, at family holidays. She paused on one of the photos, a young version of herself, smiling brightly with her mother, a picture from time before the house, before the reflection. She traced the edges of the photograph with her finger. Before, her heart tightened in her chest, and she closed the album. For the first time, she understood something in her gut that had always been elusive. The reflection hadn't just been a part of her. It had been a symptom of something far deeper. A childhood, a past, a history that she had never really faced. Her family, her mother especially, had always been distant, always disconnected, and Sarah couldn't help but wonder if the reflection was a manifestation of those buried wounds. Her mother, she realized, was still out there somewhere, living her life. And Sarah hadn't spoken to her in years. She had never fully understood why her mother had been the way she was, so cold, so distant. But now, as she sat there, staring at the photograph, she knew she had to find out. It wasn't just about confronting the reflection anymore. It was about confronting the roots of it. The next morning, Sarah pulled her phone from her pocket and scrolled through her contacts. It had been so long since she'd spoken to her mother. Years. There was a time, not long before Sarah had left for good, that she had tried to call, tried to reach out. But her mother's cold silence had made the effort feel futile. But now Sarah had something to prove. Not to her mother, not to anyone else, but to herself. She dialed the number. It rang once, twice, 3 times, and then, to Sarah's surprise, a voice answered. Hello. The sound of her mother's voice felt like a jolt of electricity through Sarah's veins. It was her mother, older, the same voice she had heard as a child, but still, the same. For a moment, Sarah froze, unsure of what to say. Mom. Sarah's voice was shaky, unexpected. It's Sarah. There was a pause on the other end of the line, a long, pregnant silence that made Sarah's heart race. She could almost hear the gears turning in her mother's mind, working through the years of distance, of estrangement. Sarah. The voice finally responded, colder than Sarah had hoped, but not as harsh as she feared. It's been a long time. I know, Sarah said, her breath hitching slightly. I've been thinking about everything. About you. About us. Her mother didn't respond immediately. The silence hung in the air between them, thick with all the unsaid words, the years of pain. And then, finally, her mother spoke again, her voice softer this time. Are you all right, Sarah? Really, The question caught Sarah off guard. She had expected her mother to be distant, curt, even accusatory. But this was different. There was something in her voice that, for the first time in a long while, sounded like concern. I'm working through it, Sarah said slowly. There's a lot I need to understand. About what happened. About why things were the way they were. I don't know if I can fix everything, but I need to understand. Another long pause. You always were determined, her mother said, the faintest hint of a smile in her voice. You're not the little girl who ran away anymore, are you? No, Sarah answered firmly, feeling something stir deep inside her. I'm not. And for the first time in years, Sarah realized something. This wasn't just about confronting the reflection. It was about reclaiming her story. It was about finding the truth buried beneath the years of pain, fear, and silence. She could confront the reflection, but to truly heal, she had to face everything that had brought her to this point. Her mother's voice returned, quieter this time. I'm not sure I can give you the answers you're looking for. But I'll try, Sarah. I'll try to tell you what I can. The journey had never been just about the house, or the reflection, or even the darkness that had shaped her for so long. It had always been about the past, about the roots of her fear. The house was just the manifestation. The reflection, the force that had controlled her, was just a symptom of the unresolved pain. And now Sarah knew that if she wanted to truly free herself, she had to break the cycle. She had to face it all, starting with the woman who had been a part of her pain for so long. The next chapter of Sarah's life had begun, not in the ruins of a house, but in the conversation she had been avoiding for years. It wasn't the end of her journey. It was just the beginning. The conversation with her mother lingered in Sarah's mind for days. Her mother's words, the tentative offering of answers, had created a sense of unease. There was so much left unsaid between them, so much that Sarah had no idea how to even begin to ask. But she knew one thing. She couldn't turn away from this. This was her chance to understand, to heal, and maybe even to finally break free from the chains of the past. Her mother had agreed to meet. It wasn't going to be easy, Sarah knew that. It had taken years for her to gather the courage to even call her. But now that she had, there was no going back. She had to know what had really happened. It was a cold, gray afternoon when Sarah arrived at her mother's apartment. She hadn't been there since she was a teenager, a time filled with too many unresolved emotions and too much distance. The building was old, its faded walls telling stories of neglect, just as Sarah's memories of her mother's home had done. Her mother had insisted on meeting in a small cafe just down the street. Sarah sat at a table near the window, staring out at the passing cars and the damp sidewalks, her hands nervously wrapped around a cup of coffee. She had no idea what to expect from this meeting. She had no idea how to even begin. A few minutes later, the bell above the cafe door chimed, and Sarah's heart skipped. She turned, her breath catching in her throat as she saw her mother step inside. Her mother looked older, much older than Sarah remembered, but there was something else there, too. A weariness in her eyes, a quiet sadness that hadn't been there before. It was almost as if she had been carrying something for a long time, something heavy and painful that had finally worn her down. Sarah, her mother said, her voice hesitant but not unkind. I didn't think this would ever happen. Sarah stood up, her hands trembling slightly, and for a moment, neither of them moved. They were both stuck in a liminal space between the past and the present, unsure how to cross it. Her mother finally took a seat across from her, folding her hands on the table. There was a long pause before she spoke again, her gaze not meeting Sarah's, but focused on the coffee cup in front of her. I didn't know where to start, her mother admitted. I never really knew how to talk to you about anything, really. Sarah swallowed hard, the words she'd rehearsed in her mind not coming out the way she'd imagined. This wasn't about anger. It wasn't about blaming her mother for everything. It was about trying to understand, about asking the right questions, even when the answers might hurt. I want to know, Sarah said quietly, her voice trembling just a little. What happened to us, Mom? Why? Why was everything so hard? Why didn't you ever let me in? Her mother's face softened, a quiet sadness in her eyes. She looked down at her hands for a moment, then back up at Sarah. I didn't know how to protect you, she said, her voice shaky. I didn't know how to protect myself. Sarah felt the air between them grow heavier. What do you mean? Her mother took a deep breath, then spoke, her words slow, as if weighing them carefully. When you were young, there was a darkness in this family. Sarah, a sickness. It wasn't something anyone talked about, but it was there, lurking. I was raised with it. My parents, your grandparents, they never spoke about it, but it was always there in the shadows. And when you were born, I thought maybe we could escape it. But then things started happening. Strange things. Unexplainable things. The words hung in the air between them, and Sarah's heart began to race. This wasn't what she had expected. Her mother had never shared any of this with her before. She had always been the cold, distant figure, the one who never offered comfort or explanation. What things? Sarah whispered, barely able to breathe as the tension in her chest mounted. Her mother looked away, her gaze distant. It was like something had been passed down, like the darkness followed me. And when you were young, Sarah, you started seeing things. Strange things that no one else could see. At first, I thought you were just imagining it, childhood fears, But then it grew worse. It was like there was something in our house, in you. Something, not right. Sarah's mind was spinning. She had always known there was something wrong with her, something that made her different. But she had always believed that it was her, that she was the broken one. That maybe it was just her mind, twisted by fear, that had created the reflection. The house, the terror. But now, hearing her mother's words, it was like the entire foundation of her reality was starting to crack. Her mother continued, her voice low and tremulous. I didn't know how to help you. I didn't know how to help us. I tried everything, therapy, medications, different places we moved to. It was like it followed us. And then, when you were about 15, the reflection. It started to appear. It was there, in the mirrors and the windows. And I couldn't stop it. Sarah's breath hitched. The reflection. It wasn't just something that had been haunting her. It had been haunting her mother too. It had been a presence, something they both had lived with, something that had followed them from place to place, never letting them truly escape. Her mother reached out, her hand trembling as she placed it over Sarah's. I couldn't protect you, Sarah. I couldn't keep it away. I didn't know how to help you. I was afraid of it too. And so I shut down. I tried to pretend it wasn't happening, pretend that you were just growing up, that everything was normal. But I couldn't do it. I couldn't face it, and I couldn't face you. So I pushed you away. The weight of her mother's confession settled over Sarah like a suffocating blanket. She hadn't been alone in her suffering. She hadn't been the only one haunted by the reflection. It had been a shared curse, something that had bound them both in its grip. Sarah felt her eyes sting, the tears she had been holding back finally slipping down her cheeks. I didn't know, she whispered, her voice breaking. I thought it was just me. Her mother's face crumpled, and she reached across the table, pulling Sarah into an embrace for the first time in years. I'm so sorry, she whispered over and over. I never meant to hurt you. I was just so scared. The walls that had stood between them for so long began to crack, and in that moment, Sarah realized something vital. The reflection, the house, the fear, it had all been born out of a legacy of silence, of pain, of a darkness neither of them had known how to confront. But now, together, they could. Sarah pulled away slightly, looking at her mother through tear-filled eyes. What do we do now? Her mother looked at her with a weary but tender smile. Now we do the hardest thing we've ever done. We face it, together. The weight of her mother's words hung in the air, thick and heavy. Sarah sat back in her chair, wiping her eyes, the storm of emotions overwhelming her. It wasn't just about the reflection anymore. It was about the years of silence, the unspoken truths that had shaped her and her mother in ways neither of them fully understood. But now, as she looked into her mother's eyes, something had shifted. There was no more avoidance. There was no more pretending. They had both suffered in their own ways, and it was time to face it. For the first time in her life, Sarah didn't feel alone. We can start by talking, her mother said softly, breaking the silence between them. By saying everything we've kept hidden, even from ourselves. I know it won't be easy, but we have to face it, Sarah nodded, the weight of the conversation still pressing on her chest. I don't know if I can handle it all at once, she admitted, her voice trembling. It's been so long. I've spent so much of my life running from it. From you. Her mother looked down, pain flashing across her face. I know, Sarah. I know. And I am so sorry. I should have been there for you. I should have been the mother you needed. But I was just as lost as you were. I didn't know how to fix it, how to fix us. I didn't know either, Sarah whispered, her throat tight. I just knew something was wrong. I thought maybe it was me, that I was broken. Her mother's hand reached across the table again, trembling. It wasn't you, darling. It was never you. They sat in silence for a while, the weight of everything between them slowly beginning to settle. Sarah felt exhausted, but not in the way she had felt before. It was a tiredness of finally facing the truth, of peeling back the layers of fear and confusion. But there was a strange relief in it, too, the beginning of something new. Tell me more, Sarah said softly. About the house, about the reflection. What was it? Why was it following us? Her mother inhaled deeply, her eyes distant. I don't have all the answers, Sarah. I just know that it wasn't a normal thing. It was something darker. It felt like it had been passed down generation after generation. A shadow that we couldn't outrun. It might have started with your grandmother, but I never had the courage to ask her. I don't know if she even knew. It's like the reflection was always lurking in the background, waiting to take hold. Her mother paused, searching for the right words. When you were little, I thought it was just my imagination, that I was seeing things in the mirrors, but then I started to see it too. And you, Sarah, you started to see it as well. I remember one night, when you were about 10, you told me that the reflection was trying to get to me. You said that it wanted to hurt me, to replace me. Sarah shivered at the memory, a chill running down her spine. She had never fully understood what she had seen in those mirrors, what had driven her to the brink of madness. But now, hearing her mother's words, it all seemed clearer. It wasn't just a figment of her imagination. It was a presence, a force, something that had been growing stronger for years. It wasn't just in the mirrors, was it? Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. It was in the house, in the walls. Her mother nodded slowly. Yes, the house. It was like it was alive with the darkness. And the more we stayed there, the worse it got. It felt like it was watching us, like it was waiting for us to give in. Like it knew our every fear, our every weakness. Sarah looked out the cafe window, lost in thought. The reflection, the house, it was more than just a nightmare. It was a part of something bigger, something older, that had followed them throughout their lives. And the deeper they dug, the more questions came to the surface. We tried to escape it, didn't we? Sarah said, almost to herself, but always found us, always followed us. Yes, her mother agreed quietly. No matter where we went, no matter how far we tried to run, it was there, like a shadow we couldn't shake off. I thought moving away would help, but it never did. Not for me, not for you. For a long while, neither of them spoke. The words seemed to fall short in the face of everything they had uncovered. But Sarah could feel a shift within herself, an unsettling yet necessary change. She had always believed that the reflection was just something that happened to her, something she had created in her own mind. But now, with her mother's words, the reality was much darker, more terrifying than she had ever imagined. She looked back at her mother, her eyes filled with determination. What do we do now? Her mother took a deep breath, the weariness still present in her voice, but tempered by a newfound strength. We have to finish what we started, Sarah. We have to face the reflection together. We have to stop running from it and confront the darkness for good. It won't be easy. It might be the hardest thing we've ever done, but it's the only way to truly end this. The words felt like a spark in Sarah's chest, igniting something within her that she hadn't realized was still alive. She wasn't alone anymore. She had her mother, and together, they could face whatever had haunted them for so long. I'm ready, Sarah said, her voice steady now. We'll do it together. Her mother nodded slowly, a faint smile on her lips. We will. The days that followed were filled with quiet preparation. Sarah and her mother talked more, unraveling the tangled knots of their past. They sifted through old journals, photographs, and letters that had long been buried, each piece of the puzzle revealing another layer of their shared history. They didn't know exactly what they would find when they confronted the reflection again, but one thing was clear. This time, they weren't running. They began to visit the house, once more, to face the darkness head-on. It wasn't easy. Every inch of the place felt like a trap, as though the house itself was still trying to pull them back into its twisted grip. But with each visit, they grew stronger, more certain of their power. They no longer feared the reflection. It was no longer something that could control them. Together, they started to unravel the mystery of the house, the reflection, and a legacy of fear that had haunted their family for generations. They found traces of old rituals, remnants of dark practices that had been passed down through the years. It became clear that the reflection wasn't just a malevolent force. It was part of something deeper, something ancient, and it had been feeding off the fear of those who lived in the house. But Sarah and her mother weren't afraid anymore. With each step, they shattered the illusion, piece by piece, until finally, they stood face to face with the reflection, not as victims, but as survivors. And when the last remnants of the darkness faded away, when the mirrors no longer held its power, they knew their journey had come to an end. They had broken the cycle, and they were free. As Sarah and her mother stood in the empty house, surrounded by the echoes of what had once been, there was a strange silence that enveloped them. It was as if the walls themselves were exhaling a long-held breath, finally releasing the grip they had held over their lives for so long. The reflection, that twisted mirror of their fears and pain, was gone. The house, too, felt different, less suffocating, less haunted, as if the malevolent presence that had once lived within it had finally been exorcised. But even in the absence of the darkness, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to uncover. The reflection had been just one piece of the puzzle, and while they had destroyed its hold, the memories of everything that had happened here still lingered. The house held a history that neither of them fully understood. It wasn't just the present that needed healing, it was the past, too. Her mother stood beside her, her hand resting on Sarah's arm, a comforting weight. The quiet between them wasn't filled with discomfort, but with a sense of shared relief. A new chapter was beginning, but it was one that would take time to unfold. "We did it," Sarah said softly, her voice breaking the silence. Her mother nodded, her gaze distant. "Yes, we did, but it doesn't feel over yet, does it?" Sarah looked around, the shadows of the house no longer oppressive, but still lingering in corners, as if reluctant to fade entirely. "No, it feels like there's more. More we need to understand. More that we need to let go of." Her mother's face softened. "I know. This house, this curse, it's been in our family for so long. I don't think it's just about breaking the reflection. It's about breaking the chains that have kept us in this cycle." Sarah nodded slowly. "You're right. The reflection might be gone, but everything that came with it. The fear, the silence, the secrets. I don't think it was just the house that was haunted. It was our family. We've been living in the shadow of something we don't fully understand." Her mother turned toward her, her eyes filled with something new, an openness that Sarah had never seen before. "We've carried that weight for generations. Sarah, it's not just about us. It's about everyone who came before us. And we don't have to carry it anymore. We can finally let it go." The words hung in the air, heavy and full of possibility. It was true. They didn't have to keep running. They didn't have to live in fear, bound to the past. They could choose to leave it behind, to break free from the shadows that had haunted their family for so long. But to truly heal, to break the chains that bound them, they would have to confront the past head-on. It wouldn't be easy. The house was just one chapter. The legacy of fear, of suffering, was something deeper, something that had been passed down through generations. The darkness wasn't just in the house. It was in the very fabric of their family history. "I think we need to find out what happened," Sarah said, her voice filled with determination. "We need to understand what this curse is, where it started, and how it ended up here. In this house, in our family." Her mother hesitated, the weight of the idea pressing on her shoulders. "Are you sure, Sarah? The house is one thing, but this goes deeper. This is about our bloodline, about things that are far beyond our understanding." "I know," Sarah said, her heart racing with a mix of fear and resolve. But we can't truly move on until we understand it. We need to break the cycle, once and for all. Her mother looked at her, a flicker of pride in her eyes. "I never thought I'd see you say that. You've grown so much, Sarah. I never thought you'd want to face the past like this." "I don't want to," Sarah admitted, "but I have to. For us. For both of us." Her mother nodded slowly, as though considering her words. "Then let's do it. But we can't do it alone. We need to know what we're up against." The next few days were a blur of research, memories, and quiet conversations. Sarah and her mother dug through old family records, letters, and documents they had long forgotten. They visited distant relatives, some of whom were hesitant to speak about the past. The more they uncovered, the more they began to piece together the haunting story of their family's history. It turned out that the curse, the darkness that had followed them, wasn't just some coincidence. It had been intentionally created, brought into their family by a relative long dead. Her great-grandfather, an enigmatic figure who had dabbled in the occult, had made a pact with something ancient. In exchange for power, for wealth, he had invited something evil into their bloodline, something that would linger in the shadows for generations. The reflection had been a manifestation of that pact, a physical representation of the dark force that had slowly taken hold of their family. It had been waiting, building its influence over time, until it finally found its way into Sarah's life, taking shape in mirrors, windows, and reflections. But what struck Sarah the most was the realization that her mother had known about it. She had known about the darkness, about the pact, and had tried, in her own way, to protect Sarah from it. But the secrets and the fear had eaten away at their relationship, leaving them both isolated and broken. As they uncovered more about her great-grandfather's actions, it became clear that the only way to truly break the curse was to confront the source of it, her ancestors' pact. And to do that, they would have to go back to where it all began. The journey would take them back to a small, isolated town where her great-grandfather had lived and worked. It was there that he had made his fateful bargain. Sarah knew that going back would force her to confront not only the past, but everything she had tried to run from for years. The house was no longer the only place haunted by the past. The town itself was steeped in the darkness her family had created. But this time, she wasn't afraid. She had her mother by her side. Together, they would uncover the truth and finally lay the past to rest. The day they left for the town was gray, the sky heavy with clouds that threatened rain. The car ride was long, and the closer they got to their destination, the heavier the air became. But Sarah could feel a shift within her, an uneasy calm that came from knowing that this was the final step. They had already faced the darkness once, and now they were going to end it for good. When they finally arrived, the town looked just as Sarah had imagined it, a place frozen in time. Old buildings lined the narrow streets, their worn facades telling stories of lives lived long ago. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, the silence broken only by the distant sound of birdsong. They drove through the town, looking for the house her great-grandfather had once called home. Sarah didn't know what to expect when they arrived, but she knew one thing for certain. Whatever they were about to uncover, it would change everything. The town felt like a living, breathing relic of the past, each street and building holding its own secret, its own long-forgotten story. As Sarah and her mother drove deeper into the heart of the town, the unease within her grew. It wasn't just the history that weighed on her. There was something about this place, something almost alive that tugged at her gut. The air was thick, and the world outside the car seemed to slow, as if time itself had forgotten to move here. "We're getting close," her mother said, her voice breaking the silence that had settled between them. "I can feel it." Sarah glanced at her mother. The older woman's face was drawn, her features tighter than she'd seen them in years. It wasn't just the physical toll of their journey, it was the emotional burden. Sarah knew her mother had been trying to protect her from the truth for so long, and now they were standing on the edge of it. Together, they were about to face the legacy of a pact made generations ago. The car turned down a narrow, cobblestone street, the buildings close enough to make the road feel cramped and suffocating. Sarah couldn't shake the sense of being watched. the weight of unseen eyes pressing on her. It was like the town itself was aware of them, of what they were here to do. After what felt like an eternity, they pulled up to a decaying building at the end of the street. It was large, with tall, narrow windows and a faded stone exterior. The house stood in sharp contrast to the well-kept homes around it, as though time had stopped for it long ago. Weeds grew in the cracks of the cobblestone path leading up to the front door, and the garden had long since been overtaken by brambles. The house looked abandoned, forgotten by everyone except for the ghosts of the past. "This is it," her mother whispered, staring at the house with a mixture of dread and resignation. Sarah nodded, her breath catching in her throat. It felt like standing on the edge of a precipice, about to dive into the unknown. The house was silent, but its very presence screamed at her. She could almost feel the weight of everything that had happened here, everything her great-grandfather had done. The energy was thick, oppressive, like the air was waiting for something, waiting for them. Together, they stepped out of the car and approached the front door. The house seemed to shrink around them with every step they took. Sarah felt like she was walking toward a nightmare, her heart pounding in her chest. Each creak of the wooden floorboards under their feet felt like a ghostly whisper, a reminder of the darkness that had once thrived here. Her mother reached for the door, her hand shaking as she touched the rusted handle. With a soft, almost hesitant push, the door creaked open, revealing a long, dark hallway inside. The smell of damp wood and dust hit them immediately, the air stale and heavy. The house had been left to rot, abandoned for years, but the weight of its history was still there. They stepped inside. The hallway stretched before them, the walls lined with old portraits that seemed to watch their every move. Sarah couldn't help but stare at them, feeling the weight of the eyes that followed her. These were her ancestors, the ones who had passed down this curse, this pact with darkness. And now, she was here to end it. The floor creaked beneath their feet as they walked deeper into the house. The silence was deafening, and Sarah's mind raced with thoughts of what they might find. What had her great-grandfather done? What had he brought into this place? And how had it affected the family for so many generations? Her mother stopped in front of a door at the end of the hallway. The door was old, its paint chipped and peeling, but the air around it felt different, charged. As if the room behind it held something they weren't supposed to see, something that had been locked away for a reason. "This is where it all started," her mother whispered, her voice trembling. "The ritual, the pact. He did something here, Sarah. I never wanted to know the full truth. But now we have to." Sarah's hand trembled as she reached for the door handle. She didn't want to know, not really. The unknown was terrifying, but there was no turning back now. She had to face the truth, even if it broke her. With a deep breath, Sarah pushed open the door. The room beyond was dark, the air thick with the smell of mildew and decay. The walls were lined with shelves, filled with dusty books and strange artifacts. But what immediately caught Sarah's eye was the large, ornate mirror hanging on the far wall. It was an antique, framed in dark wood that had long since faded into an eerie, almost unnatural shade. The mirror itself was clouded, its surface streaked with age and neglect, but it was unmistakable. This was it. This was the mirror that had started it all. Her mother stepped forward, her face pale as she gazed at the reflection. For a moment, nothing happened. The mirror simply reflected the room behind them, the dusty shelves and dim lighting. But Sarah could feel it. Something was there, something waiting. "Do you see it?" her mother asked, her voice shaking. "I can feel it. The presence. The same one that followed us. The reflection. It's here." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She couldn't see anything at first, just the dark reflection of the room. But then, as her eyes adjusted, she saw something move, just a flicker, something shifting at the edge of the mirror surface. A figure, a shadow. "Mom, what is that?" Sarah whispered, her heart racing. Her mother took a step back, her face contorted in fear. "It's him, your great-grandfather. He brought it here. He made a deal with something ancient, something evil. And he left it in the mirror. He left it for us." The reflection seemed to ripple, like water disturbed by a stone, and Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The figure in the mirror grew clearer, more defined. It was her great-grandfather, his face twisted, his eyes empty, as though he were a mere shell of a man. His mouth open, but no sound came from it. Only the sound of something scraping against the walls, a low, insidious whisper. Her mother turned away, her hands clutching her chest. "We have to destroy it," she whispered. "We have to destroy the mirror. It's the only way to break the curse. We have to destroy the last of it." Sarah nodded, but as she stepped closer to the mirror, her reflection shifted again. She saw something else now. Not her own face, but something dark, something unnatural, something alive, moving just behind her reflection. It was waiting, watching. The house seemed to groan as if the walls themselves were alive with the horror that had been contained here for so long. Sarah knew that the final step was upon them. They had come to confront the source of their family's curse. They had come to end it. But as she reached out to touch the mirror, she felt something cold and malevolent wrap around her wrist, pulling her closer. The reflection in the mirror began to change, and Sarah realized, with a growing sense of dread, that they weren't the only ones who had come to confront the darkness. The moment Sarah's fingers brushed the cold, glass surface of the mirror, a sudden surge of energy shot through her, as if the reflection itself had come alive. She recoiled instinctively, but her hand was trapped by an invisible force, as though something inside the mirror had grabbed hold of her. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she could feel her breath quickening, her skin turning icy with dread. "Sarah!" her mother screamed, rushing forward, but the force around Sarah's wrist tightened, pulling her closer to the mirror. The shadows within it grew darker, swirling like a vortex. For a moment, the reflection of the room around them flickered, and Sarah swore she could see the room behind her, the one she stood in, shifting and warping. The walls stretched and twisted, distorting like a funhouse mirror, as if the very fabric of reality was unraveling before her eyes. "Mom, help me!" Sarah gasped, panic seizing her chest. Her mother lunged, her hands outstretched, but as soon as she touched the mirror, her body jerked back with a violent jolt, as if she, too, had been electrified. She staggered to her feet, face pale, eyes wide with terror. "Don't touch it," she cried, her voice breaking. "It will pull you in too." But it was too late. The shadow and the reflection had begun to take shape, and now Sarah could see its features clearly. The figure was twisted, contorted, her great-grandfather's face, but no longer human. His eyes were hollow, his mouth twisted into a grimacing smile, and his skin was cracked like rotting stone. The reflection of him stretched and warped, his body bending unnaturally in the glass, like a creature trying to escape from the confines of the mirror. It was no longer just a reflection. "Sarah," her mother whispered, voice trembling. "It's not him anymore. It's something else." As Sarah's vision blurred, the mirror began to ripple, like water disturbed by a stone. The shadows and the reflection grew deeper, more oppressive, until they seemed to extend out of the glass itself. The room around them began to darken. The air was thick with something foul, suffocating, as though every breath they took was dragging them deeper into a nightmare. "No," Sarah whispered. "This isn't just a reflection. It's the thing he made a deal with." The air in the room grew colder, and the whispers from the mirror grew louder, a cacophony of voices that sounded like distant, desperate pleas for help. They spoke in a language she couldn't understand, but the tone was unmistakable, filled with malice, hunger, and something even darker. She could feel the malevolent presence pressing in on her, suffocating her thoughts, clouding her mind. Her mother took a step back, her hands shaking at her sides. "We have to destroy it, Sarah. We have to stop it before it breaks free." He didn't just trap the curse in the mirror. He bound himself to it too. It's been waiting to come out ever since. But how? Sarah breathed, struggling against the pull. It felt like the mirror was alive, like the very glass was breathing around her. The shadows behind her reflection twisted like something eager to break free. Her mother's eyes darted around the room, frantically searching for something. We need something to sever the connection, something to destroy it. A ritual. There's a ritual. Do we have time for that? Sarah asked, her voice trembling. She could feel the darkness tightening its grip around her wrist. The more she struggled, the tighter the invisible bond grew, pulling her closer to the mirror surface. Her mother was already moving, her face drawn with fear and resolve. She hurried over to a nearby shelf filled with old books and strange trinkets, frantically searching for something, anything, that could help. Sarah's eyes never left the mirror. The reflection of her great-grandfather's twisted face grew larger, his cracked mouth opening wider, revealing teeth that looked far too sharp to be human. The thing within the mirror wasn't just watching her. It was waiting, its hunger palpable in the air. A sudden, sharp noise broke the tension, a loud crash from somewhere deep within the house. The floorboards groaned underfoot, the walls seeming to shudder as though the house itself was alive and fighting against the very presence that had been summoned here. What was that? Sarah gasped. Her mother turned, her face tight with panic. The house, she said. It's reacting to the mirror. At that moment, Sarah felt the force of the grip on her wrist pull harder, and she screamed, feeling herself being dragged closer to the mirror, the glass now rippling like water. Her mother's voice was strained, desperate. No, you have to stay away from it. You have to focus. There has to be a way to break the bond. But Sarah could barely hear her anymore. All that mattered was the mirror, the terrible thing inside it, and the feeling of her body being drawn into it, inch by inch. Then she saw it, a book, a heavy, leather-bound tome that her mother had just pulled from the shelf. Her mother's hands fumbled through the pages, eyes scanning the ancient text frantically. There's a way. Her mother shouted, a way to break the curse, to sever the bond. But it was too late. The reflection of her great-grandfather in the mirror moved, no longer a static image, but an entity of its own. Its outstretched hand slammed against the glass, the force of it shaking the entire room. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and with a sickening crack, the mirror shattered into hundreds of sharp pieces. Sarah gasped in horror as the shadows within the mirror poured out like ink, filling the room with a darkness so thick it felt suffocating. And within that darkness, something stepped forward, a tall, distorted figure, its eyes glowing an unnatural shade of red. The figure was no longer her great-grandfather, but something far worse, a creature formed from the darkness of the pact, the thing her family had bound themselves to all those years ago. The creature's hollow eyes fixed on Sarah, and its mouth stretched into a grotesque, nightmarish grin. You have come, the thing hissed, its voice a twisted echo of her great-grandfather's. To undo what was done, but you cannot escape what you have called. You have summoned me. Her mother stepped in front of Sarah, holding the book out in front of her like a shield, chanting words from the ancient text. The words seemed to vibrate in the air, a rhythmic incantation that rattled the very foundations of the house. The creature recoiled, screeching in a horrible, inhuman sound. The shadows swirled around it, pulsating like a heartbeat. But Sarah could feel the power of her mother's words. She could feel the weight of the curse pressing back, trying to fight the incantation. Keep going, Sarah cried. You can do it. You can stop it. Her mother's face was pale, her body shaking with the strain, but she didn't stop. The words grew louder, stronger. The creature hissed again, its eyes wild with fury as the shadows around it began to break apart, fading, dissipating. But then, with a scream that shook the entire house, the creature lunged forward, its clawed hands reaching for them. Time slowed. Sarah could see everything in that one awful moment, the darkness closing in around them, the reflection of her great-grandfather still haunting the shattered pieces of the mirror, and her mother's desperate chant struggling against the malevolent force. This was the moment that would decide everything. The creature lunged toward them with terrifying speed, its twisted body contorting in ways that defied human nature. The air crackled with energy, thick with the overwhelming presence of the entity as it reached for Sarah and her mother. Its claws glinted in the dim light, sharp and jagged like knives, poised to tear through flesh. In that instant, Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, the terror almost suffocating her. Her mother's chant grew louder, each word spoken with a force that seemed to reverberate through the very walls of the house. The creature's screeching hiss grew louder too, a terrible, guttural sound that seemed to tear at the fabric of reality itself. The ground trembled beneath their feet as though the house itself was caught in a violent struggle between the two forces. The shadows surrounding the creature writhed, almost alive, as though they were trying to consume everything in their path. Then, with a sudden flash of light, the creature recoiled, its hand stopping just short of reaching Sarah. The energy in the room seemed to crackle as if something had finally snapped, an unseen barrier broken. The creature howled in agony, its clawed hand twitching violently. The darkness around it faltered for just a moment, the shadows dispersing like smoke. "No!" It screeched, its voice now a mixture of rage and desperation. It reached out again, its glowing red eyes fixated on Sarah. "You cannot undo this. This is our world now. The pact was made. You cannot take it back." But Sarah could see it now. Her mother's chant had created a barrier, a shimmering aura surrounding them. The creature was struggling against it, its claws scraping against the invisible wall, leaving streaks of smoke and darkness. Every inch of the room seemed to pulse with the force of her mother's words, the power of the ritual pushing back against the creature's onslaught. Her mother's face was pale, her eyes wide with fear and determination, but she didn't falter. She continued to chant, the words growing stronger, each syllable echoing with more power. The book in her hands trembled as if the ancient words themselves were alive. The creature's movements grew frantic, its mouth opening wide as though it were preparing to unleash a scream that could shatter their minds. It lunged again, but this time the barrier held firm. Its twisted form slammed against it, its body jolting as if the force of the collision was physically wounding it. "Please, Mom," Sarah screamed, her voice trembling. She could feel the energy surging around them, thick and heavy. "We have to finish it. Now!" Her mother nodded, her lips trembling as she continued the incantation. Sweat poured down her face, and her hands shook with the effort. The creature's body began to distort, its form flickering like a mirage as though it was slowly being unraveled. Its claws scraped against the air, but it couldn't reach them. Its movements grew more erratic, more desperate. "You can't. Stop it." The creature hissed, its voice warping. "We are the darkness. The pact will never die." But with one final, powerful cry, her mother's voice rang out in a single, resonant word, the last of the ritual. The room seemed to collapse in on itself, the walls bending and warping as though the house itself was reacting to the power in the air. The creature let out one final, terrible scream as its form shattered like glass, the shadow dissolving into a mass of darkness that spiraled into nothingness. For a moment, there was silence. The oppressive weight in the air seemed to lift, the tension slowly dissipating. The only sound was Sarah's labored breathing as she looked around the room in disbelief. The shattered mirror, the broken pieces scattered across the floor, reflected nothing but darkness now. The heavy feeling that had plagued her since stepping into this house was slowly easing, though she still felt the coldness lingering on the edges of her skin. Her mother dropped to her knees, gasping for breath, the book falling from her hands to the floor with a soft thud. Her face was pale, and beads of sweat dotted her forehead. It was clear the ritual had taken everything she had, and more. She looked up at Sarah, her eyes filled with exhaustion and relief. "It's over," her mother whispered, her voice trembling. We stopped it." But Sarah wasn't sure if she believed that just yet. The house was still dark, still heavy with the echoes of the past. The creature may have been defeated, but the memories, the lingering presence of it, still haunted the air. "Is it really over?" Sarah asked softly, her voice shaking. "Did we really break the curse?" Her mother stood shakily, wiping a hand across her face. "The curse. It was tied to the pact your great-grandfather made. When we destroyed the mirror, we severed the connection to the creature. It can't come back. Sarah looked around the room. The darkness seemed to retreat, but she could still feel the weight of history pressing in on her. She knew it wasn't just the creature they had been fighting, it was everything that had happened here, everything that had been passed down through the generations. It wasn't just her great-grandfather who had made a deal with darkness. It had affected them all, and the burden of it was something that couldn't be fully erased with one ritual. Her eyes moved to the broken pieces of the mirror. She couldn't help but wonder how much of their family's history had been sealed within its glass. How much of it had been locked away, waiting for someone to finally break the cycle. Her mother sighed, reading her thoughts. "I know, sweetheart. This place, this house, it's never really going to feel like home. But you're safe now. We're safe." But as Sarah's gaze fell on the shards of the mirror, something caught her eye, a faint reflection, glimmering in one of the broken pieces. It wasn't her own face that stared back at her, but a shadow, long and twisted, lingering in the fragments. Her breath caught in her throat as she stepped closer, trying to ignore the sudden chill creeping down her spine. The shadow shifted in the reflection, its form flickering like it was alive, as though it were waiting for something. And for a moment, just a moment, it almost seemed to smile. And then, in an instant, the reflection disappeared, leaving only the darkness. Sarah's heart raced. She didn't want to believe it. She didn't want to think that something had escaped, that the curse had left behind a trace. But as the house seemed to groan under the weight of something ancient, Sarah knew one thing for sure. This nightmare wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The room was eerily silent, save for the occasional creak of the old floorboards beneath their feet. The unsettling chill that had once permeated every corner of the house now lingered, a faint reminder of the horror they had just faced. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something still wasn't right. The reflection in the mirror shard hadn't been a trick of the light. She took a step back, her gaze fixed on the broken glass. The fragments, once sharp and dangerous, now looked like harmless pieces of an object that had been destroyed. But the memory of that fleeting shadow in the reflection stayed with her, gnawing at the edges of her mind. Her mother, still recovering from the ritual, looked weary. The strain of the incantation had clearly taken its toll, her hands trembling as she wiped the sweat from her forehead. But there was something else in her eyes now, something Sarah hadn't seen before. A flicker of doubt. "Mom!" Sarah's voice wavered as she took another cautious step toward the shards. "Are you sure it's really gone?" I saw something in the mirror. A shadow. It wasn't gone." Her mother's eyes widened, and for a split second, Sarah saw a flash of fear pass over her face. Then, just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by a forced smile. "It's over, Sarah," her mother said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "We destroyed the curse. We broke the bond." But Sarah wasn't convinced. There was something in her mother's eyes, something that didn't align with her words. She had seen the fear, the hesitation. It wasn't just the exhaustion from the ritual. Something had unsettled her. "Mom," Sarah pressed, her voice now more insistent. "That shadow in the mirror. It didn't disappear like it was supposed to. It was like it was waiting for something, waiting for a chance to come back." Her mother shook her head, taking a few steps away from Sarah, as though trying to distance herself from the conversation, from the reality of what Sarah had just seen. "It's just your mind playing tricks on you," she replied, though her voice lacked conviction. The mirror was shattered. The curse was broken. There's nothing left for it to come back to. But Sarah couldn't let it go. She was starting to piece together the puzzle. The fragmented memories from her mother's warnings, the strange behavior of her great-grandfather before he died, the fear in her mother's voice now. This wasn't just about a single entity. This was something much older, a cycle that had been passed down through generations, bound by the very walls of this house. The house that had always felt wrong, the house that had never felt like a home. "Mom," Sarah said, her voice trembling with a new kind of fear. "Do you remember anything else about the pact? Anything at all that might explain what's going on? What if we only stopped part of it? What if the mirror was only the beginning?" Her mother froze, her expression going pale. For a moment, She looked as though she were about to say something, but then she closed her eyes as if trying to push the words back. Her shoulders sagged, and she let out a long, defeated sigh. "I never wanted you to know, Sarah," her mother murmured, her voice barely audible. "I never wanted you to learn the truth about this place, about what your great-grandfather really did." Sarah stepped closer, her heart racing. "What do you mean? What did he do?" Her mother turned toward her, a look of deep sorrow in her eyes. "He made a deal with the darkness, a pact to gain power, to protect this family. But it came at a cost. The curse was never meant to be broken. It was supposed to last forever, as long as the house stood, as long as the bloodline continued." Sarah felt a chill run through her, deep in her bones. A deal? A curse? Her mother nodded grimly, her voice growing weaker. "When your great-grandfather made the pact, he bound not just himself, but all of us, every generation that followed. The curse was meant to protect us, but it also bound us to the entity in the mirror, to the darkness that waited on the other side. It's why we never leave. Why this house keeps drawing us back. The curse was never meant to be undone. But we destroyed the mirror," Sarah protested, her voice rising. "The creature, whatever it was destroyed. The pact was broken, right?" Her mother closed her eyes, shaking her head slowly. "The mirror was a part of it, yes. But the creature wasn't the true source of the curse. It was just a manifestation of it. The true power of the pact lies deeper in the house, in the foundation, in the very soul of this place." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "You mean, the house itself?" Her mother's gaze turned distant, haunted. "Yes, the house has always been tied to the curse. Your great-grandfather, he didn't just make a deal with an entity. He made a deal with something far more ancient, something that doesn't live by the rules we understand. And now, with the mirror gone, the house will begin to reclaim what was lost. It will start to unravel everything. And you will have to pay the price." Sarah felt her blood run cold. The walls of the house seemed to close in on her, the air thick with the weight of her mother's words. "We've only just begun to feel the consequences of his actions," her mother whispered, her voice barely audible. "This is the beginning, Sarah, not the end." Suddenly, the house groaned again, a deep, low rumble from deep within the walls. The lights flickered and dimmed, casting long, unnatural shadows across the room. A cold gust of air swept through the hallway, sending a shiver up Sarah's spine. "I can feel it," her mother said, her eyes wide with terror. "It's starting." Before Sarah could respond, the house shuddered violently, as if waking from a long, slumbering nightmare. The floor beneath their feet cracked with a deafening snap, and the walls seemed to bend inward, as though the very foundation of the house was beginning to warp. Her heart raced, panic surging through her. What do we do? How do we stop this? Her mother didn't answer immediately. Instead, she turned, her eyes locking onto Sarah's with a new intensity. "We can't stop it," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "But we can prepare. We have to leave this house. We have to find a way to sever the final link before it's too late." Sarah's mind raced. The house. The curse. Her great-grandfather's pact. Everything was collapsing around them, and the weight of their family's history, the darkness they had tried to bury, was finally surfacing. Her mother grabbed her hand, her grip tight and urgent. "We have to go. Now." But as they turned to flee, a scream echoed through the house, a deafening, otherworldly cry that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. The walls vibrated with the force of it, the very air seeming to scream with the weight of all the pain and terror that had been locked away for so long. The house was alive, and it was calling them back. "You cannot leave," the voice boomed from the darkness. "You are bound to me now, as your ancestors were before you. There is no escaping the pact." The voice was not just one, it was many, a chorus of whispers and cries from those who had come before them, those who had been consumed by the curse. The house seemed to breathe, pulsing with an insidious energy that threatened to swallow them whole. And in that moment, Sarah realized the full truth. The nightmare wasn't just within the house. It was the house itself. The walls trembled, the very foundation groaning as if the house itself were alive. The air thickened with an oppressive force, a weight that pressed down on Sarah's chest. The voices of the past, echoes of pain, of souls long lost to the curse, whispered from the shadows, as if reaching out from the corners of the house. Her breath caught in her throat as the reality of her mother's words hit her. They weren't just fighting an entity, they were fighting the house itself, a living, breathing thing, twisted and corrupted by the pact made long ago. "Mom, we have to do something," Sarah gasped, pulling against her mother's grip as the house seemed to close in on them. The once safe corridors now felt like traps, suffocating and endless, each turn a new, unknown nightmare waiting to unfold. Her mother's face was pale, her expression one of sheer terror. "We can't just run. It's in the walls. It's in the very ground beneath us. The house is the curse." The house creaked and groaned, its very structure seeming to shift as though it were alive, adapting to their every move. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices that filled Sarah's mind, each one carrying a different story, a different tragedy. She heard the sound of footsteps, but when she turned, no one was there. She heard faint cries, distant screams, and the mournful moans of those who had been swallowed by this place long before them. The lights flickered again, casting long, jagged shadows across the walls. For a brief, fleeting moment, Sarah thought she saw figures standing in the dark, shadowy shapes that seemed to melt into the walls, their eyes glowing faintly. Her heart pounded in her chest, panic gripping her throat. "We have to leave," her mother whispered, her voice a strained, desperate plea. "There's no time to think. We need to find the exit. Now." But Sarah wasn't listening. The whispers, the voices were growing more insistent, more desperate, and something about them sounded familiar. She closed her eyes, trying to block out the noise, but it was impossible. The house had become a labyrinth of memories, of souls trapped within its walls, all bound by the curse her great-grandfather had made. The house was feeding on their fear, growing stronger with every step they took. And then she realized one of those voices sounded like her own. Her eyes shot open, a cold realization crashing over her like a wave. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. "No, no, no. This can't be real." Her mother turned sharply, her eyes filled with alarm. "What is it, Sarah? What's wrong?" But Sarah wasn't listening. She was staring at the walls, at the shifting shadows, at the broken fragments of the mirrors scattered across the floor. She had seen it earlier, in that moment before everything had gone dark, the reflection that wasn't her own. It had been a warning, a glimpse of something she hadn't been ready to understand. The shadow in the mirror hadn't just been a warning. It had been a message. The house wants her. The thought struck Sarah with such force that it left her breathless. She stepped back, her gaze fixed on the broken mirror shards scattered around her feet, the glint of the glass catching the dim light. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest. "Mom," Sarah said, her voice barely audible, "we need to leave. We need to get out of here. Right now." Her mother's face twisted in confusion and desperation. "We can't just leave. The curse is inside the house. It's in everything. You don't understand." But Sarah wasn't listening anymore. Her focus was entirely on the mirror shards, their reflection distorted and warping. The shadow flickered again, this time moving with purpose, shifting and twisting, taking on an almost human-like form. It was following her, waiting for her to make a mistake, to step too far. She could feel it. The air around them seemed to shift again, the temperature dropping drastically as the house reacted to her thoughts. The darkness inside the walls was growing stronger, more alive, as if it were pulling them closer, dragging them into its depths. The house was alive. It had always been alive. It had been waiting, just like the thing in the mirror, feeding off their fear, drawing them in with every moment they stayed. "No," Sarah whispered again, her voice cracking. "We can't stay. I don't care what we have to do. We can't stay here any longer." Her mother's face darkened, her eyes widening with realization. "Sarah, listen to me," she said urgently, grabbing her daughter's arm. There's only one way to end it. There's only one way to break the final chain. Sarah's mind raced. The final chain? What was her mother talking about? The ritual had been completed. The creature was destroyed. The mirror shattered. What was left? Her mother's voice grew even quieter, as if she were speaking a secret only meant for Sarah to hear. The house, her mother whispered. The house can't be destroyed, but it can be freed. We have to burn it. Burn it all down. We have to destroy the source of the curse. Sarah's mind reeled. Burn it? The house? It sounded impossible, like a madness born of desperation. But as she looked around at the shadows, at the growing sense of wrongness that clung to the air, she knew her mother wasn't lying. The house wasn't just a building, it was a prison, and they were trapped inside. Her mother's eyes held a fierce determination. I've tried everything else. I've done everything I could to keep it at bay, but the pact, the curse, it's too strong. We have to end it, Sarah. The house has to be destroyed. For a moment, Sarah didn't know what to say. Everything inside her screamed that they should run, that leaving was the only way to escape. But deep down, she knew that running wouldn't save them. The house would follow. The curse would follow. The darkness would never stop until it had claimed them all. Where do we start? Sarah asked quietly, her voice barely a whisper. Her mother's eyes filled with sorrow. We start at the heart, the place where it all began. Without another word, her mother turned and led Sarah through the darkened hallways, their footsteps echoing in the vast emptiness. The house seemed to grow colder, the walls narrowing around them, and the whispers grew louder until they became deafening. They stopped in front of an old door, a door Sarah had never noticed before. It was small, almost hidden, its was dark and scarred. Her mother hesitated for a moment, then reached out and placed her hand on the door's handle. A shudder ran through her, as if the door itself were alive, reacting to her touch. This is where it all started, her mother whispered. This is where your great-grandfather's deal was sealed, and this is where it will end. With one final, heavy breath, she turned the handle, and the door creaked open, revealing a room that seemed to pulse with an ancient, suffocating energy. Inside, the walls were covered in strange symbols, twisted and dark, painted in what looked like dried blood. In the center of the room, a large stone altar stood, its surface worn and cracked. And on that altar, a dark, swirling vortex seemed to pulse, the very air around it distorted with unnatural energy. The house was alive, and Sarah knew then, with certainty, that if they didn't destroy this place, this very heart of the curse, everything would be lost. It was time to end it, to destroy the heart of the darkness before it consumed them all. But as they stepped into the room, the door slammed shut behind them, locking them inside. And in the shadows, the eyes of something ancient and terrible watched them. The door slammed shut with an earth-shattering bang, the sound reverberating through Sarah's bones, sending a wave of panic coursing through her. She spun around, pressing her palm against the cold wood, but it refused to budge. The room felt like a tomb, its oppressive darkness closing in on them. Her mother stepped forward, her face pale and drawn, her eyes fixed on the stone altar. It's begun, she muttered under her breath. The last part of the curse. The altar. We must destroy it. The air crackled with an eerie energy, thick and suffocating. The room seemed to pulse with the rhythm of something alive, as if the very walls were breathing. Sarah's breath came in shallow gasps as she turned her gaze to the swirling vortex in the center of the room. It churned like a storm, its dark tendrils stretching out like fingers, reaching toward them, trying to draw them in. "Mom, what is that?" Sarah whispered, unable to tear her eyes away from the writhing blackness. Her mother's face twisted with something between regret and resolve. "That is the heart of the curse, Sarah. The pact your great-grandfather made. It wasn't just a simple deal. It bound our bloodline to the entity that lives here, the thing that feeds on us. That vortex is the doorway, the anchor. Without it, the curse can't survive." The ground beneath them rumbled, and Sarah staggered, feeling the very foundation of the house shift. The walls groaned, as if protesting the coming end. But the vortex pulsed stronger now, as though it had sensed their intent, drawing energy from the very air around them. We have to destroy it before it pulls us in, Sarah's mother continued, her voice trembling with the weight of her words. But we can't just burn it. It won't be that simple. We have to sever the link. The altar, it's the key. It binds the house to the curse. It binds us to the house. Sarah felt a chill crawl down her spine, her mind reeling as the words sank in. Her great-grandfather's pact hadn't just created a curse. It had anchored the very soul of the house to something far older, far darker than they could have imagined. And now, to break the curse, they had to destroy the altar, the very place where it had all begun. Her mother moved toward the altar, her steps slow and deliberate, as if every step was a battle against the very force trying to pull them back. She knelt before it, her hands trembling as she reached for the jagged stone, her fingers brushing against the cold surface. The air around her seemed to hum with a strange, electric energy, the vortex above them swirling faster, its pull stronger. "We have to do this together," her mother said, her voice steady despite the fear that was evident in her eyes. "The power is too great for one person to fight alone." Sarah nodded, her heart hammering in her chest. She took a deep breath, stepping forward to stand beside her mother. The darkness around them felt suffocating, like a living entity, watching them, waiting for their mistake. "Are you ready?" her mother asked, her eyes meeting Sarah's with a mixture of fear and determination. Sarah swallowed hard, her throat dry. She wasn't sure if she was ready for this, but there was no other choice. The house had taken everything from them. It had twisted their family, trapping them in this nightmare. It had claimed the souls of countless ancestors, all bound to this cursed place. If they didn't end it now, they would be its next victims. "I'm ready," Sarah whispered, her voice filled with a newfound resolve. Her mother took a deep breath, then placed her hands on the altar, her fingers brushing the cold, jagged stone. Sarah did the same, her fingertips making contact with the surface. The instant she touched it, a sharp, searing pain shot up her arm, as if the very stone was rejecting her. She gasped, pulling her hand back for a split second before steeling herself. Focus, she told herself. She had to do this. They had no other choice. Her mother's eyes were closed now, her lips moving in a silent chant, a series of words that Sarah couldn't understand. The very air around them seemed to hum, vibrating with an energy that felt ancient, powerful. The vortex above them spun faster, faster, and Sarah could feel it. Something was awakening. Something dark, something that didn't belong in this world. Now, her mother's voice broke through the tension, and with that single word, Sarah slammed her palm back onto the altar. The room erupted with a violent force. The vortex exploded, its dark tendrils snapping outward like whips, slashing through the air. The altar beneath their hands began to crack and split, the stone groaning as if in agony. The shadows in the room writhed and twisted, taking on horrific, monstrous shapes that seemed to claw at the walls, the floor, trying to tear everything apart. Sarah's body was slammed backward with an unseen force, throwing her to the ground. The world spun, and for a moment, she thought she might lose consciousness. The room was filled with deafening sound, screams, whispers, the gnashing of teeth, the cracking of stone. The darkness pressed in on all sides, suffocating her, but she fought to stay conscious, to keep moving. Through the haze, she saw her mother, her face twisted in agony as she fought against the power of the curse, her hands still pressed firmly against the altar. But it wasn't enough. The power of the house was too great. "No!" Sarah screamed, scrambling to her feet, her body aching with every movement. "Mom, we can't give up. We have to finish it." Her mother's eyes flickered open, her face pale and drained. "We have to sever the link," she gasped, her voice barely audible over the chaos. "The final key is inside the house." Sarah's blood ran cold as she realized what her mother meant. The link wasn't just in the altar, it was in the very walls of the house. The house was the curse. The only way to stop it was to sever that connection, to destroy the very soul of the house. "We need to find the source," Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper. "We need to find the heart of the house." But as soon as the words left her mouth, a low, guttural growl echoed from the darkness, a sound like the rumbling of an ancient beast awakening from its slumber. The walls around them groaned and twisted, as if the house itself was alive, aware of them, aware of their intent. It was no longer just a house. It was a force of pure malevolence, and it wasn't going to let them leave without a fight. The room shook violently, and Sarah stumbled, feeling the floor beneath her begin to crack. She glanced at her mother, who was still gripping the altar with all her strength. It was clear now, time was running out. "We have to finish it now," Sarah cried, her voice desperate. She could feel the curse fighting back, its claws reaching into her mind, into her soul. It wanted her to give in, to let go. But Sarah wasn't going to give in. With one final, frantic push, Sarah grabbed her mother's hand. Together, they forced themselves to their feet, their minds focused, their bodies trembling with the weight of their task. The house was trying to pull them under. But Sarah and her mother had one thing the house didn't, a will to fight back. And they were going to tear the house down, even if it meant everything they knew would burn in the process. The floor beneath Sarah cracked wide open, splintering as though the house itself were breaking apart. The walls trembled with an almost animalistic fury, a deep, guttural growl rumbling from the very foundations of the building. The curse, the house, was fighting back. Every breath felt like a battle, every heartbeat like a countdown to something terrible. But Sarah's resolve only hardened. The whispers, the clawing shadows, the creatures lurking at the edges of her vision, they all wanted her to fail. They wanted her to fall into despair, to give in to the suffocating dark. But she couldn't. She wouldn't. Her mother, trembling and weak, still gripped the altar, her face a mask of pain. Sweat poured down her brow as she chanted something Sarah couldn't quite understand, her hands shaking as if they were being burned. The swirling vortex above them was growing more violent, the air thick with a dense, dark fog that seemed to weigh down on their very souls. The entire room groaned under the pressure. The altar split open with a deafening crack, revealing a dark, glowing stone at its center. It pulsed with an eerie, unnatural light, the source of the curse. It was alive, alive in a way that no human or spirit should be. It was the heart of the house, and it had to die. "We have to destroy it," Sarah gasped, her voice raw, trembling with exhaustion. Her body ached from the energy the house had drained from her. "We have to break the heart of the house." Her mother's eyes flickered up at her, and for a moment, Sarah saw a flash of fear. "We can't just destroy it, Sarah. We have to cut it off from a source. The house is the source." The ground cracked again, the stone altar splintering in every direction. The shadows around them thickened into tendrils that reached out, wrapping around Sarah's legs, her arms, trying to pull her into the dark, into the endless, suffocating void. She screamed, struggling to break free. "Mom!" she shouted, her voice breaking through the chaos. "Help me!" With a final, desperate surge of energy, her mother pulled herself towards Sarah. The weight of the house seemed to lift slightly as her mother reached her side, her breath ragged. She grabbed Sarah's hand, her grip firm and steady despite her exhaustion. Together, they turned toward the heart of the house. The vortex above them swirled violently, and a cold, disembodied voice echoed in their minds. "You cannot escape. You cannot win. You are mine forever." Her mother's voice was firm, resolute. "We are not yours. This house does not own us anymore." With a deep breath, they both lifted their hands toward the stone at the altar's core. The dark stone pulsed beneath their touch, and they could feel its pulse as though it were beating like a heart, pounding in rhythm with their own. And then, with all the strength they had left, they pressed down on it. The stone shattered with a deafening crack, a burst of light blinding them both. The very air around them seemed to distort as the pulse of the curse throbbed and stuttered, like a dying beast gasping for breath. The house screamed. The walls twisted and buckled, the foundation shaking violently as if the house were coming undone. The shadows began to retreat, their forms dissolving into nothingness. The suffocating darkness that had clung to the walls faded, unraveling as the curse lost its power. And then, all at once, it stopped. The house went silent. The air, once thick with malevolent energy, cleared, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Sarah could breathe. The oppressive weight that had pressed down on her chest, the fear that had held her in place for so long, was gone. The darkness had lifted, but the house wasn't finished. From the corners of her vision, Sarah saw the last remnants of the curse begin to disintegrate, shadows that once took form, now vanishing into the air. The walls cracked open, splintering, crumbling under the weight of their own destruction. The house had begun to fall apart, the very foundation of it unraveling as it had no reason to exist anymore. Her mother staggered beside her, her hands still trembling, but her eyes were filled with a strange kind of peace. "It's over, Sarah. The house is gone." They stood there for a long moment, just staring at the remnants of the altar, the now broken stone where the curse had once lived. The house, the darkness, the curse, all of it was unraveling, and in its place was only the remnants of a battle long fought. But it wasn't done. Not yet. Sarah turned, scanning the crumbling room one last time. The walls groaned in protest, dust falling from above. Her chest tightened as she thought of everything they had been through, the horrors they'd faced, the family history that had led them here. And then, she turned toward her mother, who was looking at her with something like awe. "What now?" Sarah asked, her voice soft but determined. Her mother took a deep breath. "Now we leave. We go home. There's nothing left for us here. It's over." But as Sarah looked toward the door, toward the light streaming in from the shattered windows, she knew that she couldn't stay in the past any longer. The house, its curse, had shaped them, but it no longer held them captive. The world outside was waiting. They walked out into the light, the sun warming their faces, feeling like a new day had begun. The house that had been their prison, their torment, was gone, and with it, the curse that had haunted their family for generations. It had ended with them. But as Sarah turned back one final time, she saw the remnants of the house's broken structure. And for just a moment, just a flicker of time, she thought she saw something move within the ruins. A shadow, a whisper, but it was gone as quickly as it had come. With a final, steady breath, Sarah turned and walked away, her mother beside her, toward a future that would no longer be shaped by fear. It was over, and the house was no more.